Hey there, tonight we're diving into the grimy world of medieval Gong farmers, uncovering why it truly stunk to be the unsung heroes of sanitation. The truth is, their job was as perilous as it was pungent. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights, or find that perfect pillow position, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're knee-deep in the filth of medieval England, and I'm not even being metaphorical here. Welcome to the life of a Gong farmer in the 14th century, where your job is as dirty as it sounds, yet surprisingly essential. Let's face it, the medieval world wasn't all knights, castles, and damsels in distress. Someone had to deal with the less glamorous side of life, the side that stinks, literally. And guess what? That someone is you. In a bustling city with about 30,000 souls, there are a lot of things to be managed, and waste is definitely high on that list. The medieval city wasn't exactly an exemplar of sanitation, and cesspits were the norm. Think of these pits as the medieval equivalent of a modern-day waste management system, minus the technology and hygiene standards. You, as a Gong farmer, are tasked with cleaning out these pits. It's a job that people love to forget, yet cannot live without. And here's a kicker. This stinky gig is actually a structured profession. Now, while you might expect the job to be a bottom-of-the-barrel position, pun intended, it actually paid decently for the times, about a penny a day. That might not sound like much, but remember, we're in the 1300s. A penny could buy you a loaf of bread or a pint of ale, which is essential when you're dealing with the medieval world's less savory aspects. Plus, considering the risk of disease and the general unpleasantness, you could argue that Gong farmers deserved even more. Economically, the medieval world was a complex web of trade, agriculture, and yes, waste management. The Pukanami was a real thing. Cities were growing, populations were booming, and with that growth came an overwhelming amount of waste. You could think of it as job security, albeit a smelly kind. Your work was crucial for the health of the city. Without you, streets would overflow with filth, and disease would spread even faster than it already did. But here's the inconvenient truth. People were superstitious about all things unclean, and that included you. Despite your essential service, you were often shunned or avoided. The irony here is rich. You're cleaning up other people's messes, yet you're the one considered untouchable. In a way, you were the unsung hero of urban life, keeping the city livable, one cesspit at a time. Socially and politically, being a Gong farmer put you outside the typical medieval hierarchy. You weren't a peasant tied to the land, nor were you a merchant or craftsman. You floated in this strange liminal space where your job was necessary, but not exactly celebrated. Talk about a medieval identity crisis. Yet the demand for your services meant you weren't at the very bottom of the economic ladder. You had a niche, and in the medieval economy, niches could be quite valuable. The sheer volume of waste you dealt with is staggering when you think about it. With a population of 30,000, you're looking at thousands of pounds of waste on a daily basis. And all of this had to be transported out of the city, often under the cover of night, to avoid the prying eyes and pinched noses of the public. It was a logistical nightmare that somehow worked, largely thanks to your efforts. And then there were the tools of the trade. Forget about gloves and masks. Those are luxuries of the modern age. You had a shovel, a wheelbarrow, and if you were lucky, a trusted partner. The job required both physical endurance and a strong constitution. It's not a gig for the faint-hearted, yet despite the grime and the stink, you got the job done night after night. Now, don't get me wrong. There's a certain romanticism to the medieval era. A simpler time, people say, when life was more connected to nature. But let's be real. Life was tough, dirty, and often short. The romantic images of knights and courtly love overshadow the gritty reality that someone had to clean up the mess. And in that reality, the Gong farmer played an indispensable role. So, as you wade through the night, wheelbarrow loaded with the city's refuse, remember this. While history might not sing your praises, your contribution is foundational. The city couldn't function without you. And in the end, maybe that's what makes your story so compelling. You're the unsung hero we never knew we needed, keeping the medieval world from drowning in its own muck. Cheers to that. even if the smell leaves a lot to be desired. Yet, despite your role as the unsung hero, the social scene wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet for you. No medieval feasts, no gallant knights tipping their helmets in your direction. Instead, you were more likely to find yourself the butt of jokes, or worse, completely ignored. The social stigma attached to being a Gong farmer was as inescapable as the smell you couldn't quite scrub off. It was like walking around with a neon sign that said, "Caution, smells like yesterday's dinner." The medieval social hierarchy was a curious beast, a bit like a pyramid, but with more layers of grime. At the top, you had your royalty and nobility, living it up in drafty castles, feasting on mutton and keeping their hands mostly clean. Just below them were the merchants and craftsmen, the engine room of medieval urban life, making and trading all the things that kept the economy ticking. And then there was you, the Gong farmer, nestled firmly between the rats and the plague. You were necessary, but definitely not someone the townsfolk would invite over for tea, or whatever medieval England's equivalent of a casual coffee was. This social isolation was enforced not just by whispered words and sidelong glances, but by law. You see, Gong farmers were often required to live on the outskirts of town, far from the bustling markets and chatter of village life. This wasn't just a matter of keeping the smell at bay. No, it was a reflection of the broader societal biases of the time. People feared what they didn't understand, and medieval folk didn't understand you. Or rather, they didn't want to. You were a reminder of the filth they preferred to forget. But here's where it gets interesting. While society might have shunned you, there was a strange camaraderie among your fellow muckrakers. It was like an exclusive club that nobody wanted to join, yet those who did found a certain bond in their shared isolation. In the quiet hours of the night, while the rest of the city slept, you and your comrades would gather, shovels in hand, to tackle the monumental task ahead. Conversations were likely shouted over the squelch of muck and the rattle of wheelbarrows, but they were genuine, full of shared gripes and gallows humor that only those in the trenches, or pits, rather, could really appreciate. Despite the social cold shoulder, you did have your own medieval version of networking. Forget LinkedIn. Your connections were forged in the crucible of shared hardship. You knew who had the best routes through the city, who could get you a decent deal on a new shovel, and which tavern would let you in for a pint despite the lingering odor. It was a network built on necessity and mutual respect, even if the rest of society pretended not to notice. And while you might not have been swiping right on medieval Tinder, your profession did come with a certain earthy appeal. After all, what's more attractive than job security, right? In a time when life was brutal and short, having a steady gig, even one as odorous as yours, meant you weren't living hand to mouth like many of your contemporaries. You could afford bread, ale, and maybe even a little something extra. And that, in its own way, was a kind of power. Still, the societal biases were hard to avoid. The very people who relied on your services would cross the street to avoid you. It was like being the janitor in a high school who knows all the secrets but still eats lunch alone. You were integral to the health of the city, acting as a bulwark against the waves of disease that could, and often did, ravage the population. Yet the gratitude was minimal, if not entirely absent. The isolation wasn't just social, it was also physical. Living on the outskirts meant you were often excluded from the vibrant life of the city. The fairs, the markets, the church gatherings, these were events you might catch glimpses of from afar, like watching a parade through a fogged-up window. Sure, you could sneak in every now and then, but you were always aware of the eyes, the whispers, the subtle shifts in the crowd to give you a wide berth. But let's not paint too grim a picture here. There were moments of levity, too. Times when your fellow farmers would find humor in the absurdity of it all. After all, when you're knee-deep in muck, sometimes all you can do is laugh. It's like that scene in every good war movie where the soldiers share a joke in the trench. Dark humor in the face of grim reality. Your life was a series of contradictions. Essential yet ignored. Employed yet isolated. Respected for your work, but disdained for your role. You were living proof that the medieval world wasn't all chivalry and charm, but a place where practicality often collided with prejudice. And so, night after night, you trudged through the streets, shovel in hand, wheelbarrow groaning under the weight of the city's refuse. You were a ghost, a shadow, doing the work nobody else wanted to think about, let alone do. And yet, in your own way, you were keeping the city alive, one cesspit at a time. As you cleared the muck, you also cleared a path for humanity to flourish amidst the filth. So the next time you hear someone waxing lyrical about the good old days, remember this. History might have forgotten your name, but it owes you more than a few clean streets and a healthier populace. Here's to you, the unsung hero of medieval sanitation, trudging through the muck with a grim smile and a shovel, keeping the wheels of history turning, one scoop at a time. And speaking of keeping the wheels of history turning, let's dive into the daily grind of a Gong farmer, pun absolutely intended. Imagine your alarm clock is the moon, because your work kicks off when the sun goes down. Why? Because medieval folks had a knack for turning up their noses at things they didn't like, and your job topped that list. So, under the cover of night, when the streets were as empty as a plague doctor's social calendar, you and your fellow muckers got to work. Your tools of the trade were a bit less glamorous than a knight's sword. No shining steel or intricate craftsmanship here, just a trusty shovel, a sturdy bucket, and maybe, if you were lucky, a wheelbarrow with wheels that didn't squeak like a tortured cat. Forget about protective gear. Your best defense was a strong stomach and a prayer that the wind wouldn't turn. The logistics of waste collection were akin to a military operation, minus the glory. First, you hit the cesspits, those delightful medieval inventions that were essentially just holes in the ground where everyone's business ended up. These pits could be anywhere from 3 to 6 feet deep. If you were really lucky, you'd find them only half full. Full pits were the stuff of nightmares, or at least work shifts that felt like nightmares. You'd start with your shovel, breaking up the crusty tarp layer, then scoop and lift, until your bucket was full. Think of it as a medieval workout routine. Who needs CrossFit when you've got cesspits? Transporting the filth was another feat of engineering genius. You trundle your wheelbarrow through the deserted streets, hoping the rickety thing wouldn't tip over and spill its fragrant cargo. The goal was to get the waste out of the city, often to designated dumping grounds outside the walls. These were strategically placed to keep the stench and potential disease at bay, though how effective that was is another question. Historical records suggest that even with your nightly efforts, the medieval city wasn't exactly smelling like roses. And let's talk about the risks. Because, believe it or not, shoveling excrement in the dead of night isn't the safest gig. Disease was the obvious enemy. In a time when the Black Death was just around the corner, swimming in human waste wasn't the healthiest lifestyle choice. You were face to face with bacteria that modern medicine wouldn't even identify for another few centuries. The risk of infection was ever present, and a simple cut or scrape could lead to a serious illness. Your immune system had to be as tough as your resolve. Then there were the literal pitfalls. Those uncovered cesspits were hazards in their own right. One wrong step, one moment of distraction, and down you go into the abyss. It wasn't just a messy situation. It could be downright dangerous. These pits weren't exactly designed with safety in mind, more like a medieval version of guess and hope. Falling in meant more than just an embarrassing story. It could be a life-threatening situation. Now, while the job was about as glamorous as a damp dish rag, it wasn't without its moments of weird camaraderie. There's something about sharing a night shift with a group of equally grimy souls that creates a bond stronger than the stench in the air. You'd swap stories, maybe share a laugh or two about the absurdity of it all, and occasionally you'd even find a sliver of pride in the fact that, despite everything, you were keeping the city livable. Sure, you weren't saving princesses or slaying dragons, but you were battling a very real beast, the ever-growing mountain of medieval waste. In economic terms, your role was part of what kept the city's heartbeat steady. Waste management, even of the most basic kind, was essential for urban life to continue. The city couldn't function without you, and while you might not have been showered with gold, or really showered at all, you had job security. Ironically, the more waste there was, the more secure your position. It's like being a firefighter in a city made entirely of kindling. Socially, however, you might as well have been invisible. People needed you but didn't want to acknowledge it. You were like the medieval version of an IT guy, only noticed when things went disastrously wrong. It's a curious thing, really, how necessity doesn't always translate to respect. You were the unsung cog in the machine, the ghost in the city's narrative, ensuring that the wheels kept turning, even if they were covered in muck. As you navigated the nightly labyrinth of alleyways and streets, you could see the city in a way no one else did. Quiet, still, and vulnerable. It was a perspective unique to those who worked in the shadows, a view that offered a strange kind of beauty amidst the grime. You'd see the moon casting its silver glow over cobblestones, hear the distant hoot of an owl, and feel the cool night air on your face, a small respite from the heat of the day and the heat of your toil. But don't get too caught up in the romance of it all. Remember, you're knee-deep in filth, and while the moon might be shining, the reality is still a bucket of human waste at your feet. It's this constant duality that defines your life, a mix of necessity and neglect, of grit and gratitude that never quite materializes. The job wasn't just about physical endurance. It demanded a mental resilience, too. Surviving day after day in a society that barely acknowledged your existence required a certain toughness. You had to find satisfaction in the small victories, a pit emptied, a night completed without incident, a rare moment of recognition from someone who saw beyond the smell. And so, night after night, you continued your rounds, a silent guardian of the city's health. You were a part of the medieval ecosystem, a necessary counterbalance to the chaos of urban life. While the city slumbered, you were awake, working to ensure that it could rise again with the dawn. In a world that often forgot you existed, you were, in your own way, indispensable. As you finished your shift and the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, you'd head back to the outskirts, back to your isolated life, until the moon called you to work once more. It was a cycle as relentless as it was essential, a dance between light and shadow, between acknowledgement and anonymity. And though history might not remember your name, the city's survival was your silent testament, a tribute to your unheralded labor. So, here's to you, the midnight muckraker, the underappreciated artisan of the underbelly, the keeper of the city's most inconvenient truths. Despite the muck, myths, and medieval madness, let's cut through the crap, pun intended, and tackle some entrenched myths about the life of a Gong farmer. Was it really as horrific as it sounds, or has history done a number on their reputation, layering on the filth a bit too thickly? First, let's address the myth that Gong farmers were universally reviled. Sure, they weren't getting invitations to royal banquets, but they weren't exactly the medieval pariahs history makes them out to be. In fact, contemporary accounts reveal a grudging respect for their work. A city official's document from 1388 in York highlights the critical nature of their labor, emphasizing that without them, the city would be knee-deep in trouble, literally. So, while they might have been the butt of jokes, at least some folks understood their value to the urban ecosystem. Now, let's talk about the supposed squalor and danger of the gig. Yes, the job was as fragrant as a fish market in July, but was it a death sentence? Not quite. Although disease was a clear and present danger, the records don't show an epidemic of Gong farmers dropping dead from the plague. They were surprisingly resilient, possibly because exposure to all that muck might have actually bolstered their immune systems. They were the gritty canaries in the coal mine of medieval sanitation, minus the tragic fate. Moving on to the tools of the trade. No, it didn't have high-tech gear, but they weren't exactly bare-knuckling it either. The humble shovel and bucket were the medieval equivalents of a surgeon's scalpel and forceps, crude but effective. And let's not forget the wheelbarrow, a medieval marvel that, while it didn't feature the latest in ergonomic design, got the job done. Forget the tales of bare hands and primitive sticks. They had the basics to get by, even if those basics were about as cutting-edge as a blunt butter knife. Now for the economic angle. The idea that Gong farming was a dead-end job is only half the story. Sure, it was no fast track to the nobility, but let's consider the perks. For one, it was recession-proof, waste weights for no man. Plus, with a decent penny a day, a Gong farmer earned enough to enjoy life's simple pleasures, like a loaf of bread or a pint of ale. Compare that to the average peasant, who might toil for a whole day just to scrape together a crust of bread. In the world of medieval gig economy, you could do worse. And while social isolation was real, it wasn't a life sentence. The idea that Gong farmers lived as outcasts is a bit exaggerated. True, they were often required to live on the outskirts, but this was as much about zoning laws, medieval style, as about social ostracism. Living outside the city walls was like having a house in the suburbs. Less glamorous, maybe, but with certain practical advantages, like avoiding the hustle and bustle of city life. Plus, the outskirts offered a bit more space for their pungent work, allowing for a breath of fresh air, literally and metaphorically. But what about the common trope that they were all single and loveless? While their dating pool might have been somewhat limited, the myth of their solitary existence is more historical hyperbole than fact. Records show that many Gong farmers had families, and some even passed their trade down to their children. Love in the time of latrines was possible, it seems, even if their courting rituals were less Romeo and Juliet, and more wheelbarrow and shovel. Speaking of family legacies, let's address the myth that no one wanted to follow in their footsteps. Sure, it wasn't a job you bragged about at the medieval equivalent of career day, but it offered stability. In an era when most people were one bad harvest away from destitution, a steady, if smelly, job wasn't something to sniff at, unless you were downwind. And what of the supposed isolation? While they might not have been the toast of the town, Gong farmers formed tight-knit communities. They shared tips, routes, and the occasional pint, creating bonds as strong as the stench they battled. It was a fraternity of sorts, where the initiation ritual involved more muck than merriment, but camaraderie abounded nonetheless. In debunking these myths, we see a clearer picture of the Gong farmer's life. Not glamorous, but not the hellscape of historical lore. They were essential cogs in the medieval machine, their labor underpinning the very health and survival of urban centers. They might not have been celebrated in song or statue, but without them, cities would have collapsed under the weight of their own waste. So, while history may have painted them as society's outcasts, the reality was more nuanced. They were the unsung heroes of sanitation, a testament to the grit and grime of medieval life. The myths tell a story of hardship, but the truth reveals a tale of resilience and indispensable contribution. As we scoop away the legends, we find the real story beneath, a story of survival, community, and the unsung toil that kept the medieval world from drowning in its own detritus. And as the moon wanes and dawn creeps closer, remember that the Gong farmer's tale is far from over. There's still more to uncover about their world, their strategies, their struggles, and the surprising ways in which they shaped the course of history. So, stay tuned as we dig deeper into the trenches of time, unearthing the truths hidden beneath the muck. As we unearth the layers of the past, it's clear that Gong farmers were more than just medieval muckrakers. They were unsung architects of urban life. Picture this. Medieval cities were like pressure cookers with the lid slightly askew. They were bustling, chaotic, and one bad sanitation day away from exploding into an epidemic. Enter the humble Gong farmer, the unheralded hero who kept the city from quite literally drowning in its own waste. You see, their work was the medieval equivalent of hitting the reset button every night, ensuring that the cesspits didn't overflow and that the streets remained passable, if not exactly pristine. Now, why should you care about these medieval custodians of cleanliness? Because their work laid the groundwork, pun intended, for modern sanitation. Without their nightly toil, the leap from medieval filth to the relative cleanliness of the Renaissance would have been more like a hesitant harp. The gradual development of waste management systems owes much to these gritty laborers. By the 16th century, cities like London began to recognize the importance of organized waste removal, leading to regulations that would eventually evolve into the public health measures we take for granted today. It's not a stretch to say that without Gong farmers, the urban centers of Europe might have succumbed to their own squalor, leaving behind nothing but a cautionary tale of what happens when societies ignore their dirty work. Let's dig into the numbers, shall we? The 14th century saw the population of London balloon to over 50,000 people. That's a lot of bodies, and naturally a lot of waste. The Gong farmers were tasked with managing this mountain of muck, a job that required not only muscle, but also a surprising amount of logistical savvy. These were the original operations managers, coordinating routes and timing to ensure maximum efficiency. Forget the romance of knights in shining armor. These were the foot soldiers of sanitation, waging a nightly battle against the encroaching tide of filth. Yet the irony is rich. Despite their indispensable role, Gong farmers were as invisible as the air. They were the ones ensuring that the city didn't collapse under its own refuse, but their contribution was often overlooked. This invisibility, however, was a double-edged sword. It allowed them to work without much interference, but it also meant that their contributions went uncelebrated, their legacy buried beneath layers of historical negligence. They were like the janitors of history, unseen yet essential, keeping the engine of urban life humming along. And while it's easy to romanticize the past, visions of cobblestone streets, horse-drawn carts, and quaint marketplaces. The reality was far grittier. Cities were teeming with life, yes, but also with the detritus of that life. Waste was the inevitable byproduct of human habitation, and without the diligent efforts of Gong farmers, medieval cities might have become uninhabitable. Their work made life in these urban centers not just passable, but bearable, turning cesspits into stepping stones on the path to modern civilization. The Gong farmers' role, then, was one of paradox and practicality. They were both marginalized and central, shunned yet indispensable. Their work was the backbone of urban growth, allowing cities to expand and populations to flourish. In a way, they were the unsung midwives of modernity, facilitating the birth of the urban landscape we know today. They were the guardians of public health before public health was even a concept, the unsung champions of cleanliness before anyone thought to sing their praises. So, where does that leave us? With a newfound appreciation for those who toil in the shadows, keeping society afloat against the tides of neglect and waste. Gong farmers were the original unsung heroes of urban life, their legacy a testament to the power of unseen labor. The next time you flush a toilet or toss a piece of trash, spare a thought for these medieval muckrakers who, without fanfare or glory, laid the foundations for the cities we call home today. In wrapping up our muck-laden journey, let's tip our hats, and not our noses, to the Gong farmers. They were the sanitation pioneers who, with shovel in hand and grit in their hearts, transformed the landscape of medieval Europe. Their legacy, though largely forgotten, is etched into the very fabric of urban history. They remind us that behind every grand historical narrative lies the toil of those who did the dirty work, ensuring that the wheels of progress kept turning, one cesspit at a time. And isn't that a legacy worth remembering? In the early 19th century, if you wanted a poster child for Prussian aristocracy, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone more fitting than Otto von Bismarck. Picture a young man with the swagger of a rock star, the audacity of a rebel, and a penchant for dueling that would make even the most seasoned Wild West gunslinger think twice. Bismarck was born in 1815, a year that also saw Napoleon getting booted out of power for the last time. Coincidence? Maybe. But fate seemed to have earmarked Bismarck for greatness, or at least for a lot of drama. Growing up in the Junker class, the landed gentry of Prussia, meant young Otto had a front-row seat to privilege. His family estate, Schönhausen, was the kind of place where you could imagine leisurely strolls, intense political debates, and perhaps impromptu fencing lessons on the lawn. His early education was as rigorous as it was uninspiring for him, filled with the kind of strict disciplinarian teaching that would make modern students cringe. But young Bismarck was not the type to be tamed by rote learning. In fact, he was more likely to be found planning some mischief or challenging a classmate to a duel than diligently studying. Ah, dueling. Nothing says, future statesman, quite like the clang of sabers at dawn. During his university years, Bismarck was known for participating in no fewer than 26 duels. Yes, 26. And while the modern mind might picture this as a romantic swashbuckling affair, it was often more about proving one's manliness than actual mortal combat. It's safe to say that for Bismarck, a scar was just another accessory to show off at the next aristocratic gathering. But don't be fooled by the bravado. These duels were serious business. They were governed by strict codes of honor, and the slightest insult could lead to a face-off. For Bismarck, it was a rite of passage, a way to establish his reputation among his peers. Plus, it was a decent workout. Despite his rambunctious youth, Bismarck was no fool. He enrolled at the University of Göttingen, a place that was less about academic rigor and more about who you knew. There he studied law, or at least pretended to, while cultivating friendships that would serve him well in the future. He was part of the Borussia Corps, a student society known for its drinking and dueling, essentially a fraternity with swords instead of ping-pong balls. It was here that Bismarck honed his skills in debate and persuasion, traits that would later earn him the nickname, the Iron Chancellor. But before he could become the Iron anything, Bismarck had to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. After a brief and unremarkable stint in the civil service, which he found as thrilling as watching paint dry, he returned to manage his family estates. It was a move that seemed to align more with pastoral serenity than political ambition. Yet, even amidst the tranquility of rural Prussia, Bismarck was restless. The political landscape of Europe was shifting, and Bismarck felt the pull of something greater than estate management and social gatherings. The 1840 were ripe with revolutionary fervor across Europe, with liberal ideas challenging old monarchies and traditional power structures. For someone like Bismarck, who had a foot firmly planted in the old world yet an eye on the future, this was both frightening and exhilarating. He wasn't exactly a revolutionary himself, not by a long shot, but he was keenly aware of the winds of change blowing through the continent. Bismarck's entry into politics was as much a product of circumstance as it was of ambition. In 1847, he was elected to the newly created Prussian Diet, the Landtag, where he quickly made a name for himself as a staunch conservative. But let's not sugarcoat it. Bismarck's early speeches were more fiery than refined, more reactionary than revolutionary. He was a defender of the status quo, the monarchy, and traditional Prussian values. However, his ability to argue his point with a sharp tongue and sharper wit caught the attention of those in power. Despite his conservative stance, Bismarck was no mere yes-man. He had the rare ability to see the bigger picture and adapt his strategies accordingly. His talents weren't lost on King Wilhelm I, who would later become his greatest ally. But it wasn't until the political upheaval of 1848, when revolutions swept across Europe like an unstoppable wave, that Bismarck truly began to shine. In this chaos, he saw opportunity. The upheaval showed him that the old ways were crumbling, and he needed to be part of crafting the new order. So, what's a young, ambitious, and slightly rebellious aristocrat to do? If you're Bismarck, you dive headfirst into the world of diplomacy and politics, ready to make your mark, but not before indulging in a bit more youthful rebellion. After all, why rush into nation-building when you can enjoy a few more sword fights and late-night debates over steins of beer? Bismarck's early years were a cocktail of privilege, rebellion, and a dash of destiny. He was a man of contradictions, aristocrat and rebel, duelist and diplomat. Yet, it was precisely these contradictions that made him so effective. He was a man who could navigate the murky waters of politics with the ease of a seasoned sailor, always steering toward his ultimate goal. And while the world might have seen him as a brash young man with a penchant for duels, Bismarck saw himself as a leader in the making, one who would eventually reshape Europe with an iron will and a strategic mind sharper than any saber. This was just the beginning of a journey that would see him become the architect of German unification and leave an indelible mark on world history. But that's a story for another time. For now, let's raise a glass to young Otto, duelist, debater, and future Iron Chancellor. Cheers. And so, our tale of young Otto, the not-so-gentleman duelist but budding political tactician, is set to dive into the grand chess game of 19th century Europe. Fast forward to the 1860, and you'll find Bismarck, not just an aristocrat with a penchant for sharp objects, but now a major player on the Prussian political stage. He swapped the dueling scar for a diplomat's pen, a move that would make even Machiavelli nod in approval. First up, the Danish War of 1864. Now, if you've ever thought international politics was just a lot of hot air, Bismarck's maneuvers might change your mind. This was not just a squabble over borders. It was a calculated step in a much larger game. At stake were the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. These territories were like the real estate equivalent of a shiny new convertible everybody wanted a piece. Why? Well, they were strategically positioned next to the North Sea and the Baltic, valuable for trade and military positioning. So when Denmark tried to incorporate Schleswig into its kingdom, Bismarck saw his opening. Bismarck's strategy during the Danish War was as slick as oil on a courtroom floor. He knew he needed allies to pull this off, so he roped in Austria, the long-time frenemy of Prussia, to tag along in this adventure. It was the classic, the enemy of my enemy is my friend move. Together, Prussia and Austria quickly overpowered Denmark. But make no mistake, Bismarck's handshake came with an agenda. Once the dust settled, it was time to divvy up the spoils. And surprise, surprise, Bismarck had no intention of sharing equal slices of pie with Austria. This was just the setup for his next act. Enter the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, also known as the 7 Weeks' War, because you guessed it, it lasted a grand total of 7 weeks. This was no marathon. It was a sprint, a full-on blitzkrieg before the term was even coined. Bismarck's plan: dislodge Austria from German affairs and set Prussia as the top dog in the German states. And here's where his diplomatic dexterity truly shone. He managed to secure the neutrality of Russia, France, and Italy through a series of treaties and promises that would make a modern-day lawyer's head spin. Bismarck had a knack for turning the political map into a board game, one where he could move the pieces with a flick of his wrist. He promised Italy Venetia if they joined against Austria, and assured France of neutrality with a vague hint of territorial compensation. These weren't just alliances, they were traps wrapped in velvet. Bismarck understood that treaties were often more about keeping your allies close and your enemies closer. In the end, his diplomatic juggling act paid off. Prussian forces, utilizing their superior rail network and the breech-loading needle gun, a technological marvel of the time, decimated the Austrian army at the Battle of Königgrätz. Bismarck's Realpolitik was a masterclass in pragmatism over ideology. He wasn't interested in conquest for conquest's sake. Instead, he had his eyes set on unifying the German states under Prussian leadership. The victory over Austria allowed him to dissolve the old German Confederation and establish the North German Confederation, a crucial stepping stone towards unification. Austria was left out in the cold, licking its wounds, while Bismarck stitched together his new political tapestry. But let's not get too carried away in the romanticized version of Bismarck as a unifying hero. The man was as much a maestro of manipulation as he was a statesman. He understood that power was not just about territory, but about influence, about being the puppet master behind the scenes. The treaties he brokered were often laced with conditions that ensured Prussia's dominance while keeping potential rivals at bay. He played the long game, understanding that today's ally could be tomorrow's adversary. And there's the irony. For all his talk of unity, Bismarck's tactics were as much about division and control. He was a man who could smile while sliding a dagger between your ribs, a political operator who thrived on the chaos he so deftly managed. Perhaps it's this very duality that makes Bismarck such a compelling figure. He was as charming as he was ruthless, a man who could win a war with one hand while signing a peace treaty with the other. So here we stand at the threshold of a new era. The stage is set for Bismarck's final act in unifying Germany, but the journey is far from over. The Franco-Prussian War looms on the horizon, a conflict that would finally cement his legacy, but at a cost that would echo through the ages. But let's not jump ahead. There's more political intrigue and backroom deals to explore, more myths to debunk and truths to uncover. As the pieces fall into place, remember that Bismarck's unification of Germany was as much about cunning as it was about conquest. Stay tuned, because the real show is just beginning. As the curtain rises on the Franco-Prussian War, Bismarck is once again at the helm, steering the ship of state with the confidence of a seasoned sea captain navigating treacherous waters. But this wasn't just another war in the chronicles of Europe. It was the grand finale in Bismarck's symphony of unification, orchestrated with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer wrapped in velvet. Let's dive straight into the juicy bits. The Ems dispatch, a diplomatic telegram that was as explosive as it was cleverly manipulated. The year was 1870, and France was led by Emperor Napoleon Roman III, a man more eager for glory than a peacock at a beauty pageant. The immediate spark, a dispute over the Spanish throne of all things. When a Hohenzollern prince was offered the Spanish crown, France saw red, literally and politically. Napoleon Roman III demanded assurances from Prussia that no Hohenzollern would ever sit on the Spanish throne. Enter the Ems dispatch. King Wilhelm I of Prussia, vacationing at the spa town of Ems, sent a routine update to Bismarck about his meeting with the French ambassador. Now, Bismarck, with his flair for drama, saw an opportunity to twist the narrative. He edited the dispatch to make it sound as though the French ambassador had been insulted, and voila, French press was in an uproar, and Napoleon Roman III, goaded by public opinion, declared war on Prussia. Talk about a masterclass in diplomatic manipulation. The myth of the Franco-Prussian War is often painted with strokes of glory and national pride, a David versus Goliath tale, with plucky Prussia taking on the mighty French Empire. But peel back the romantic veneer, and you'll find the grim realities of 19th century warfare lurking underneath. For starters, the war was as much about logistics as it was about heroism. The Prussians had the edge with their efficient railway network, allowing them to mobilize troops with the precision of a Swiss watch. We're talking about moving over 460,000 soldiers to the front lines in mere weeks. It was less about gallantry and more about timetables and track gauges. And let's not forget the technology. The Prussian army wielded the Drace needle gun, a breech-loading rifle that allowed for faster firing than the French muzzle-loading chassepot. It was a technological edge that turned engagements into massacres, with battles like Sedan resulting in the capture of Napoleon Roman III himself and 100,000 of his soldiers. Glamorous? Hardly. The reality was a grim tableau of smoke, steel, and blood, a far cry from the sanitized glory often associated with epic battles. Bismarck's war wasn't just a military affair. It was a geopolitical chess match with Europe as the board. By defeating France, Prussia not only secured its place as the dominant German state, but also shifted the balance of power on the continent. The war culminated in the proclamation of the German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles in January 1871. Irony, thy name is Bismarck. Here was Germany, newly unified, celebrating in the very heart of French opulence, a move that was as much about rubbing salt in the wound as it was about national pride. But let's pause and ask, at what cost did this new empire come? Yes, the German states were united, but the path there was paved with the bones of soldiers and the tears of civilians. Around 180,000 French and 51,000 German soldiers lost their lives, and countless more were wounded. The civilian toll was staggering, with untold suffering as the war raged through towns and countryside. Empire building wasn't just about grand speeches and flag-waving. It was a process soaked in blood and sacrifice. And here's the kicker. Bismarck, the architect of so much conflict, was fundamentally a man who sought peace. Well, his version of it. He believed in securing a stable Europe through a balance of power that kept potential rivals in check while ensuring Prussia's dominance. It was the paradox of his diplomacy: peace through war, stability through upheaval. In the end, his vision for a unified Germany was realized, but in doing so, he set the stage for tensions that would simmer and eventually boil over into the 20th century's world wars. Bismarck's legacy is a tapestry woven with threads of ambition, pragmatism, and contradiction. He was a man who could wield diplomacy like a sword and a sword like a pen. His unification of Germany marked the dawn of a new era, but it also left a Europe deeply scarred and forever changed. As we stand on the brink of Bismarck's next political maneuvers, remember that history isn't just a series of dates and battles. It's the story of human ambition, of dreams realized and shattered, and of the enduring impact of one man's vision on the world stage. So, as the dust settles on the battlefield and the map of Europe is redrawn, the story of Otto von Bismarck marches on, full of twists and turns that continue to shape the world we live in today. Stay tuned for more intrigue as the newly minted German Empire navigates the choppy waters of diplomacy and power politics in the years to come. The Iron Chancellor may have forged a new nation, but his work is far from done. So here we are, folks, with Bismarck at the helm of a shiny new German Empire, freshly carved out of the chaos of the Franco-Prussian War. You might think that after orchestrating such a spectacle, he'd kick back with a stein of beer and enjoy the fruits of his labor. But no, our Iron Chancellor had other plans. He was ready to dive headfirst into a new arena, domestic policy. And trust me, it was every bit as tumultuous as the battlefield. First on the agenda, tackling the internal religious strife that was bubbling up like a bad 19th century soap opera. Enter the Kulturkampf, Bismarck's infamous campaign against the Catholic Church. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like a grand ideological crusade, let me stop you right there. The Kulturkampf was less about high-minded philosophy and more about political pragmatism. In Bismarck's eyes, the Catholic Church was an unruly rival with too much influence, especially among the southern German states. So, what did he do? He went full throttle, enacting laws that basically put the Church in a political straitjacket. Between 1871 and 1878, Bismarck introduced a slew of anti-Catholic measures. The May Laws, which put clergy under state control, and the expulsion of Jesuits, to name a couple. The aim, to curb the Church's meddling in secular affairs and ensure that loyalty to the state came first. But surprise, surprise, it backfired. Instead of weakening the church, the Kulturkampf galvanized the Catholic community, transforming them into a political force to be reckoned with. Not exactly a textbook example of strategic brilliance. While Bismarck was busy wrestling with bishops, he was also plotting another domestic revolution, this time in the social realm. Picture this. It's the late 19th century, and the Industrial Revolution has transformed Germany into an economic powerhouse. But with great industry comes great inequality. Enter Bismarck's social welfare programs, the first of their kind in the world. In a move that would make modern politicians do a double take, he introduced health insurance in 1883, accident insurance in 1884, and old-age pensions in 1889. These weren't just philanthropic gestures. They were strategic masterstrokes designed to keep the working class from flirting with socialism. Ah, socialism, the buzzword that kept Bismarck up at night. To him, socialists were the boogeymen lurking in the shadows, ready to unravel the carefully stitched fabric of his empire. So in 1878, he pushed through the anti-socialist laws, banning socialist organizations, meetings, and publications. On paper, it was a crackdown on radicalism. In practice, it was a game of political whack-a-mole. The socialists just went underground, strengthening their resolve while Bismarck's authoritarian streak grew more pronounced. You might be scratching your head, wondering how a man could champion progressive social reforms while simultaneously smothering political dissent. But that's Bismarck for you, a walking contradiction, the political equivalent of a cat that's both in and out of the bag. His leadership style was a curious cocktail of carrots and sticks, progressive yet authoritarian. He built safety nets with one hand while wielding a sledgehammer with the other, a balancing act that was as precarious as it was ingenious. And let's not forget the economic context. The 1870 and 1880 were a time of massive industrial growth, with Germany's coal and steel production skyrocketing. By the 1890, Germany had surpassed Britain in steel output, cranking out over 8 million tons a year. This industrial boom was the backbone of Bismarck's domestic policies, allowing him to fund his social programs while maintaining a tight grip on the political landscape. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Bismarck's policies were often reactive rather than proactive, shaped by the shifting sands of political necessity. His attempts to outmaneuver the Catholic Church and socialists were as much about consolidating power as they were about governance. It's the kind of realpolitik that doesn't make it into the romanticized tales of nation-building, but is crucial for understanding the man behind the iron mask. And let's talk about those missteps, the policies that were more oops than eureka. The Kulturkampf, for example, was quietly abandoned by 1878, with Bismarck conceding defeat and seeking reconciliation with the Vatican. His anti-socialist laws, while initially effective, only served to strengthen the resolve of the socialist movement, which would later become a formidable political force in the Weimar Republic. Not exactly the kind of legacy you want etched into the history books. Yet, despite these blunders, Bismarck's domestic policies laid the groundwork for a modern welfare state, a legacy that continues to influence social policy worldwide. His ability to juggle progressive reforms with authoritarian control was a testament to his political acumen, even if it occasionally led to some spectacular faceplants. As we navigate the labyrinth of Bismarck's domestic policies, it's clear that his approach was far from one-dimensional. He was a master of adaptation, a chameleon who could shift his colors to suit the political climate. Whether it was battling the papacy or placating the proletariat, Bismarck's domestic agenda was as complex as it was controversial. So, as we wrap up this exploration of Bismarck's internal maneuvers, remember that his story is a tapestry of contradictions. It's a tale of a man who could wield the pen like a sword, and the sword like a pen, crafting policies that were as innovative as they were oppressive. And while his domestic exploits may not have the cinematic drama of his military campaigns, they were no less significant in shaping the Germany that emerged from the 19th century, a nation that was both modern and medieval, progressive and reactionary. Stay tuned, because there's still more to uncover in the saga of the Iron Chancellor. As we look ahead to his twilight years, and the challenges that lay in wait. Remember that Bismarck's legacy is not just about what he built, but also about the lasting impact of the choices he made. The stage is set for the next chapter, and it's bound to be a riveting ride through the annals of history. As we tiptoe into the twilight of Otto von Bismarck's career, picture this. The Iron Chancellor, once the puppet master of European politics, now finds himself tangled in the strings of his own creation. It's 1890, and Bismarck is facing a political climate shift as dramatic as a Shakespearean play, complete with betrayal, intrigue, and a cast of ambitious young actors, most notably the new Kaiser, Wilhelm Roman II. Wilhelm Roman II was a different breed from his predecessor, Wilhelm I. If Bismarck was the grand architect of the German Empire, Wilhelm Roman II was the kid who just inherited the keys to the castle and couldn't wait to redecorate. At 29, he had the energy of a teenager on a caffeine binge and the subtlety of a bull in a china shop. He was keen to leave his mark on Germany and saw Bismarck's overbearing presence as a relic of the past. The stage was set for a showdown, and in this drama, there was only room for one leading man. Bismarck, who had spent decades playing the long game, suddenly found himself outmaneuvered by a monarch who preferred short, dramatic moves. Wilhelm Roman II was all about personal rule and had little patience for Bismarck's cautious diplomacy. The clash came to a head over, of all things, social policy. Bismarck, ever the pragmatist, wanted to extend the anti-socialist laws, believing socialist movements were the termites threatening to eat away at the empire's foundation. Wilhelm, on the other hand, favored a more conciliatory approach, aiming to win over the working class with promises of reform. It was like watching a tug-of-war, where both sides were determined to pull in opposite directions. The final straw was the Kaiser's insistence on having the final say in policy decisions, a move that made Bismarck's blood boil. The Iron Chancellor was used to being the puppeteer, not the puppet. The resulting power struggle was as inevitable as it was explosive. In a maneuver that would have made Machiavelli proud, Wilhelm Roman II demanded Bismarck's resignation on March 18, 1890. And just like that, the Iron Chancellor was out, leaving his office at 75 Wilhelmstrasse, a building that had become synonymous with his reign for the last time. Now, let's not paint Bismarck's dismissal as some tragic downfall. He wasn't exactly dragged out kicking and screaming. By this point, Bismarck was a man weary from years in the political arena, and his departure was as much a relief as it was a defeat. As he retired to his estate at Friedrichsruh, he left behind a Germany that was both unified and deeply divided, a nation on the brink of modernity, yet haunted by the shadows of its past. So, what did Bismarck's departure mean for Germany and Europe at large? In the short term, it opened the floodgates for Wilhelm Roman II to pursue his vision of a new course in foreign policy, one that would ultimately steer Germany into the choppy waters of World War I. Without Bismarck's steadying hand, the careful balance of alliances he had crafted began to unravel. The reinsurance treaty with Russia, a keystone of Bismarck's diplomatic architecture, was allowed to lapse in 1890, leading to a rapprochement between France and Russia. It was a diplomatic blunder of epic proportions, one that Bismarck himself would have likely avoided with a deft flick of his pen. The long-term consequences of Bismarck's policies were a mixed bag, as paradoxical as the man himself. On one hand, he had unified Germany and established it as a major player on the world stage. His social welfare programs laid the groundwork for the modern welfare state, influencing policies far beyond Germany's borders. On the other hand, his iron-fisted approach to politics left a legacy of authoritarianism that would haunt Germany well into the 20th century. Bismarck's legacy is often romanticized as the handiwork of a political genius, a man who could see the chessboard 10 moves ahead. But let's not forget the unintended consequences of his actions. His Kulturkampf alienated Catholics. His anti-socialist crusade only strengthened the resolve of his adversaries, and his Realpolitik, while brilliant, created a Europe teetering on the edge of conflict. The alliances he forged were built on a house of cards, and when he was no longer there to play the game, the whole structure wobbled precariously. For all his achievements, Bismarck was a man who thrived on control, a control that slipped through his fingers as soon as he left the stage. The nation he helped create was a patchwork of conflicting interests, bound together by the force of his will. Without him, the seams began to fray, unraveling into the chaos that would engulf Europe in the 20th century. Yet, it's important to remember that Bismarck was not a one-dimensional character. He was both a product of his time and a man ahead of it. His leadership was a curious blend of vision and opportunism, of conservative values and progressive policies. He was a man who could wage war and maintain peace with equal dexterity, a chameleon in the political jungle. As the curtain falls on the story of Otto von Bismarck, we're left with a legacy as complex as the man himself. He was a titan of his era, and his influence extended far beyond the borders of Germany. But like all great figures in history, his legacy is a double-edged sword, a testament to his brilliance and a reminder of the perils of unchecked power. So, as we close the book on the Iron Chancellor, let's raise a glass to the man who reshaped the map of Europe and left a mark that endures to this day. Cheers, Otto, for better or for worse, you changed the world. Once upon a time, in the days when the world was a bit less connected, a sprawling network of trade routes emerged that would make even the most seasoned globetrotter's passport look like a grocery list. This was the Silk Road, kicking off around 130 BCE, not just a single road, but a tangled web stretching a staggering 4,000 miles from China to the Mediterranean. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a modern logistics nightmare, only with more sandstorms and fewer tracking numbers. Now, the Silk Road wasn't just about silk, although that shiny fabric was the headliner. It was about the flow of goods, ideas, cultures, and let's be honest, a fair amount of danger. If you were a merchant looking to make your fortune, or a government official trying to expand your empire's reach, this was the highway to opportunity, or to a dust-filled demise. Geographically speaking, this wasn't a leisurely stroll through the countryside. We're talking about a route that cut across some of the most unforgiving terrains on Earth. From the arid deserts of Central Asia to the towering peaks of the Pamir Mountains, travelers had to contend with more than just the occasional pothole. And let's not forget the Gobi Desert, where the only thing harder than the sand was the tempers of those who got lost in it. Enter the camel, the real MVP of this ancient road trip. These creatures were the original all-terrain vehicles, capable of hauling goods across the desert while scoffing at the very idea of air conditioning. They could carry up to 600 pounds, travel 20 to 25 miles a day, and go without water for a week. That's right, a week. In a time when most travel involved foot-slogging or horse riding, camels were the Elon Musk of transport innovation. Efficient, reliable, and a little bit spitty. But why endure such an ordeal just to move some silk and spices? The economic motivations were as clear then as they are now. Profit, prestige, and power. Silk, with its shimmering texture, wasn't just a fabric. It was a symbol of status and wealth. It was so prized that the Roman Senate supposedly tried to ban it because they feared it would make Rome soft and effeminate. Clearly, they hadn't met any Romans wearing silk togas with an attitude. Spices were another hot commodity, literally. They were used to preserve food, mask the taste of less than fresh meat, and in a pinch, make your enemies sneeze. A pound of black pepper could cost the same as a sheep, which might explain why people were willing to risk their lives for a spice rack that would make today's chefs weep with envy. Of course, with great trade comes great peril. Merchants had to be wary of bandits who were less interested in the cultural exchange and more in the give us your stuff or else business model. These marauders knew the routes as well as any legitimate trader and were always ready to relieve a caravan of its goods, and sometimes its lives. And then there were the elements. Sandstorms could whip up out of nowhere, turning a pleasant day of trading into a scene straight out of a disaster movie. Travelers had to be prepared for anything, which often included a lack of decent snacks. Forget your modern road trip pit stops. These traders were lucky if they had some dried meat and a few dates to munch on as they navigated the treacherous paths. But the Silk Road wasn't just about the exchange of goods. It was about the exchange of ideas. Buddhism, for instance, found its way from India to China along these routes, hitching a ride with merchants and monks who spread its teachings. In return, Chinese inventions like paper-making and gunpowder began their own journey westward, changing the face of warfare and bureaucracy forever. In short, the Silk Road was a testament to human ingenuity, resilience, and a touch of madness. It was a place where the world met and mingled, where fortunes were made and lost, and where the quest for luxury goods drove people to the ends of the earth. So next time you slip into a silk shirt or sprinkle a pinch of pepper on your pasta, spare a thought for the countless souls who braved the harsh realities of this legendary trade route. They didn't have GPS, but they had guts, and that's what kept the Silk Road alive for centuries. And so, the Silk Road didn't just transport silk and spices. It was a sprawling superhighway of ideas and innovations. Think of it as the ancient internet, but with more camels and fewer cat videos. The cultural exchanges that occurred along this route were nothing short of revolutionary, and not just because they involved actual revolutions. Ideas weren't just whispered over campfires, they were shouted across continents. Take Buddhism, for example. This wasn't just a religion that stayed put in India. No, it hitched a ride with traders and monks who spread its teachings all the way to China, where it was embraced like the hardest new trend. The trip was worth it because Buddhism wasn't just a spiritual import. It was a cultural juggernaut, influencing everything from art to politics. In return, Chinese innovations like paper and gunpowder decided to take a little vacation westward, where they would later change the face of the world. Literally. Imagine the surprise of European bureaucrats when they realized that paper was a much more convenient way to keep records than, say, carving into stone tablets. And then there were the cities. Oh, the cities. They were the bustling heartbeats of the Silk Road, places like Samarkand and Antioch that would make modern metropolises look like sleepy villages. Samarkand was not just a city, it was a legend in its own time. Located smack dab in the middle of the Silk Road, it was a melting pot of cultures, a place where Persian poets and Chinese traders might share a cup of wine while debating philosophy or the latest camel upgrades. Samarkand was so important that Tamerlane, the great conqueror, made it his capital in the 14th century, filling it with so much architectural bling that it seemed to challenge the very concept of modesty. Antioch, on the other hand, was the Roman Empire's eastern jewel. Situated near the Mediterranean, it was a hub of trade and culture where the East met the West with all the grace and subtlety of a head-on collision. It was here that Greek, Roman, and Jewish cultures blended, sometimes harmoniously, but often with the kind of conflict that would make a modern reality show look tame. Still, this cultural clash was a breeding ground for new ideas, sparking debates and innovations that would ripple through history. Now, let's talk hospitality. If you think modern urban posts with their tiny toiletries and welcome chocolates are impressive, you haven't seen anything yet. Ancient Silk Road cities took hospitality to a whole new level. Travelers could expect to be greeted with feasts that could rival a royal banquet. Inns, or caravanserais, dotted the landscape, offering a place to rest weary limbs and swap stories with fellow travelers. These establishments were like the ancient version of the local bar, where everyone knew your name, or at least your trade goods. The hospitality customs could be overwhelming, with hosts often offering guests the best of everything, sometimes even at the expense of their own families. Forget turning down the bed. These folks might have turned down their own dinner in your honor. But let's not romanticize too much. While it sounds like a continuous cultural conveyor, the Silk Road was also a place of stiff competition and occasional clashes. The truth is, not everyone was happy about sharing ideas or trade secrets. Cities and states often vied for control over key sections of the route, as the wealth it brought was too tempting to ignore. Skirmishes were not uncommon, as different factions tried to assert dominance over the lucrative trade. Imagine a bustling bazaar where every vendor is trying to outshout the others, but with swords and political machinations. So yes, while the Silk Road was a conduit for cultural exchange, it was also a stage for human ambition and rivalry. It's a tale as old as time. Where there's profit, there's competition. But it's precisely this mix of collaboration and conflict that makes the Silk Road so fascinating. It wasn't just a road. It was a tapestry of human endeavor, woven together with threads of silk and strands of ambition. This network of routes wasn't just about connecting places. It was about connecting people, with all the complexity, messiness, and brilliance that entails. As we pause on this bustling crossroads of history, let's leave the story open to the next chapter, where further intrigue, innovation, and maybe a few more sandstorms await. The Silk Road was far more than a trade route. It was the lifeline of a world in constant motion, forever changing and forever fascinating. And we've only just begun to unravel its many stories. As the Silk Road script continues to unfold, let's dive into the political drama and devious chess moves that would make any Game of Thrones fan feel right at home. You see, the Silk Road wasn't just about exchanging silk for spices or pepper for papyrus. It was the ultimate power play field for empires vying for dominance. Picture it as a massive board game, only with real stakes and a lot more sand. First up, we have the Han Dynasty, whose leaders were not exactly the chill, benevolent types you might imagine. Nope, these guys had ambitions as vast as the deserts their caravans crossed. Around 138 BCE, Emperor Wu of Han decided he had enough of the pesky Xiongnu nomads causing trouble on his borders. So, he sent Zhang Kaiyan, a diplomat with the patience of a saint and the courage of a lion, to forge alliances with other tribes in Central Asia. Zhang's mission was to find allies to give the Xiongnu a taste of their own medicine. Spoiler alert, Zhang got captured by the Xiongnu, spent over a decade as their not-so-willing guest, and eventually escaped. Talk about dedication to the job. When Zhang Kaiyan finally made it back to China, he returned with tales of exotic lands and lucrative trade opportunities. His reports weren't just filler for the emperor's bedtime reading. They kicked off a frenzy of expansion and trade. This was a big deal. The Han Dynasty expanded its territory, securing key sections of the Silk Road, and in the process, filling their coffers with foreign riches. The road became a vital artery for the empire, pumping in wealth and ideas. But let's not romanticize it too much. This expansion wasn't just about spreading good vibes and dumplings. It involved economic exploitation and hefty labor demands on local populations, who were less than thrilled to be the emperor's new workforce. Now, let's switch gears to the other end of the Silk Road, where the Roman Empire was grappling with a silk addiction that would make any fashionista proud. Roman elites couldn't get enough of the stuff. By the 1st century CE, silk had become the ultimate status symbol in Rome, draping senators and socialites in shimmering luxury. It was so popular that the Roman Senate tried to ban it, fearing it would lead to moral decay and economic ruin. Spoiler, banning silk was about as effective as telling cats to stop climbing on furniture. The demand for silk was more than just a fashion statement. It became a political tool. Rome's insatiable appetite for the material created a trade imbalance with the East, where they had little to offer in return except precious metals. This imbalance drained Roman coffers, leading to economic strain and political tension. The emperors of Rome weren't exactly benevolent rulers either. They were more like magicians, trying to keep the empire afloat while dealing with empty coffers and a populace that was starting to notice the emperor wasn't wearing any clothes, literally and figuratively. As these two empires played their high-stakes Game of Thrones, the Silk Road itself became a pawn, manipulated by leaders eager to gain control of its lucrative routes. The road was a living entity, constantly shifting as political alliances changed and power dynamics evolved. Leaders like Zhang Kaiyan were sent scuttling across the continent, not just as diplomats, but as strategic pieces in an imperial game of chess. The real winners were often the middlemen, the merchants and traders who navigated these political waters as deftly as they crossed the deserts. They knew how to play the game, leveraging their position to gain wealth and influence while empires bickered over borders and trade privileges. But let's not overlook the local populations who bore the brunt of these power plays. The myth of the benevolent emperor is just that, a myth. The reality was far harsher. As empires expanded, local communities found themselves caught in the crossfire. They were expected to labor for the empire, building infrastructure, and supplying goods without seeing much of the profit. It was economic exploitation on a grand scale, a reminder that the glittering allure of the Silk Road came with a hefty price tag for those who lived along its paths. So, while the Silk Road was a symbol of cultural exchange and economic opportunity, it was also a battleground of political intrigue and imperial ambition. The flow of silk, spices, and other goods was driven by the relentless pursuit of power, prestige, and profit. Empires rose and fell, leaders schemed and plotted, and yet the road endured, a testament to human ambition and folly. As we continue our journey, remember that behind every silk robe and spice trade, there was a story of power, politics, and the people who sometimes got caught in the crossfire. And with that, we leave the tale open for the next chapter, where more mysteries and maneuvers await on the ever-rolling Silk Road. As we continue our trek along the Silk Road, let's dive into the nuts and bolts of the operation. Literally. We're talking about the technological marvels and infrastructural wonders that made the Silk Road more than just a glorified desert walkabout. This was the era when human ingenuity decided to flex its muscles, giving us inventions and constructions that would make any modern civil engineer nod in respect. First up, let's chat about paper. Yes, that humble sheet you scribble your grocery list on as an origin story worthy of a Marvel superhero. Around 105 CE, a Chinese eunuch named Kai Lun decided bamboo strips and silk weren't cutting it for note-taking. So, he invented paper using mulberry bark, hemp and fishnets. And just like that, the world had a new medium for keeping records, writing poetry, and drafting passive-aggressive memos. Paper wasn't just a Chinese secret for long. It floated westward along the Silk Road, eventually changing the way the world communicated. Imagine trying to send a love note on a clay tablet. Talk about heavy messaging. Now, shifting gears to navigation, because getting lost in the vastness of Central Asia wasn't exactly on anyone's bucket list. The Chinese, ever the innovators, invented the south-pointing chariot. This nifty little contraption used a differential gear system to keep a pointer always aimed south, even as the chariot changed direction. It was the ancient equivalent of a GPS, minus the annoying recalculating voice. This invention helped traders keep their bearings across the sprawling networks of the Silk Road, ensuring that they didn't end up trading silk to polar bears. But technological advancements were only part of the story. Let's talk infrastructure, specifically caravanserais. These ancient inns were the Silk Road's answer to modern truck stops, offering weary travelers a place to rest, refuel, and maybe catch up on the latest caravan gossip. Scattered every 20 to 30 miles, they were strategically placed within a day's journey from each other, because no one wanted to camp in the middle of nowhere with only camels for company. Each caravanserai was a beehive of activity, bustling with merchants, traders, and the occasional thief eyeing the goods a little too eagerly. They were architectural marvels, fortified to fend off bandits, with spacious courtyards and stables for the animal fleet. Think of them as the ultimate ebb with a side of medieval security. However, the Silk Road wasn't all smooth sailing or riding. Maintaining these routes was a logistical nightmare wrapped in red tape. Tolls and taxes were the norm, as local rulers saw trade as a golden goose to be plucked, not just petted. The Sogdian merchants, for instance, were notorious for navigating these bureaucratic mazes with the finesse of a cat burglar in a jewelry store. They paid tolls at every border, sometimes multiple times within the same region, as various fiefdoms demanded their cut. This wasn't a toll booth with a friendly wave. It was more of a pay up or we'll confiscate your camels sort of deal. And let's not forget the bureaucratic hoops traders had to jump through. Imagine trying to get a permit to transport goods through a dozen different mini-kingdoms, each with its own set of rules, and a ruler who thought he was the next big thing. Traders had to be part diplomat and part accountant, keeping meticulous records to avoid fines that could wipe out their profits faster than a sandstorm. It was a delicate dance of diplomacy, negotiation, and sometimes a little under-the-table dealing to keep things moving. So, while the Silk Road might conjure images of exotic goods and cultural exchanges, the reality had more in common with a modern-day road trip gone awry. Traders faced everything from extortionate tolls to downright bureaucratic lunacy. Yet, despite these challenges, they persevered, driven by the promise of profit and the allure of new markets. The Silk Road wasn't just a trade route. It was a battleground of persistence, innovation, and a touch of madness. As we pause on this bustling crossroads of history, it's clear that the Silk Road was much more than a series of pathways. It was a living, breathing entity shaped by the ingenuity and resilience of those who dared to traverse it. From the invention of paper to the construction of caravanserais, the Silk Road stands as a testament to human determination and creativity. And as we leave this chapter open for the next leg of our journey, let's remember that behind every trade route lies a story of grit and glory, just waiting to be unraveled. As the Silk Road's bustling arteries carried the lifeblood of ancient trade, change was looming on the horizon, like a storm cloud gathering over a sunlit desert. Fast forward to the 15th century, and the once mighty Silk Road found itself facing a midlife crisis of epic proportions, courtesy of a little thing called maritime trade. Enter stage left, the age of exploration, where sailors with more guts than Google Maps set sail to find faster, cheaper, and less sandy ways to connect the world. In the grand scheme of history, the rise of sea trade routes was as inevitable as a sequel to a surprise box office hit. When Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498, he wasn't just charting a new course for Portugal. He was effectively writing the Silk Road's obituary. The allure of a sea route to the riches of the East was too tempting for European powers, who were tired of playing the Silk Road's game of tolls, taxes, and territorial tantrums. By the turn of the 16th century, maritime routes had begun to siphon off trade like a leaky faucet, leaving the Silk Road high and dry. But why was sea trade so appealing to these intrepid adventurers? Well, for starters, it bypassed the political patchwork quilt that was Central Asia. No more negotiating with a dozen different rulers or paying tribute just to move a cartload of silk from point A to point B. On the water, the only toll collectors were pirates, and let's face it, they were easier to deal with than some of the landlocked bureaucrats. Moreover, ships could carry more cargo than a caravan of camels, making the potential profits as vast as the oceans themselves. Political upheavals added more fuel to the Silk Road's slow decline. The Mongol Empire, which had once united vast swaths of the route under a single banner, disintegrated into a kaleidoscope of warring factions by the late 14th century. The Pax Mongolica, that brief period of relative peace and stability, shattered like a dropped porcelain vase. Without a central power to maintain order, the Silk Road became more of a dangerous gamble than a lucrative enterprise. Travelers faced increased risks from banditry and local skirmishes, making the sea's siren call even more seductive. Let's not forget the Black Death, which swept through Europe and Asia in the 14th century, leaving a trail of devastation that would make any zombie apocalypse look like a minor inconvenience. It wasn't just people who suffered. Trade routes were hit hard as well. With a significantly reduced population, the market for luxury goods dwindled, and the Silk Road's economic engine sputtered like a camel on its last legs. Yet, even as the Silk Road's physical routes faded into the sands of time, its legacy endured like the aroma of a well-spiced dish. The cultural connections it fostered were more enduring than any empire, leaving an indelible mark on the world. Ideas that traveled the Silk Road laid the groundwork for modern scientific thought, from the spread of mathematical concepts to the exchange of medical knowledge. The route had been a melting pot long before the term was invented, blending cultures, languages, and religions in a way that continues to influence societies today. The Silk Road's impact on global economic systems was equally profound. It was the crucible where the principles of trade and commerce were forged, creating a template for future economic networks. The concept of supply and demand, the use of credit, and the idea of international trade agreements all have their roots in the bustling bazaars of the Silk Road. It was globalization before globalization was cool, with merchants and traders setting the stage for the interconnected world we inhabit today. So, as we wrap up this whirlwind tour of ancient trade routes, it's worth pondering what the Silk Road teaches us about our own era of jet-speed globalization. The high-speed sequel to these ancient dramas is playing out in real time, with technology and trade binding the world closer than ever before. But just as the Silk Road's decline was precipitated by political turmoil and shifting economic currents, so too does modern globalization face its own set of challenges. Perils of losing touch with history are all too real, as the lessons of the past can guide us in navigating the complexities of the present. In the end, the Silk Road was more than a mere conduit for goods. It was a testament to human ambition, ingenuity, and the relentless drive to connect. As we blaze our own trails in the modern world, let's keep a wary eye on history's rearview mirror, remembering that the road to progress is paved with both triumphs and tribulations. Because if there's one thing we've learned from the Silk Road, it's that the journey is just as important as the destination, a lesson as timeless as the shimmering silk that once traveled its storied paths. If chaos had a heyday, it was the Warring States period of ancient China, a time when the land was less a country and more a dysfunctional family reunion where everyone brought swords. Picture about 260 years of non-stop, cutthroat competition among 7 major states, each vying for the title of most likely to conquer the neighbors. The geography alone is enough to make your head spin. We're talking about a place the size of modern-day Japan, only with more intrigue and fewer cherry blossoms. In the middle of this turbulent era, we meet Qin Shi Huang, a name that might sound like a sneeze, but will go down in history as a powerhouse. The man was born in 259 BCE, just as the bickering kingdoms were hitting the peak of their contentious crescendo. His birth name was Ying Zheng, but like a rock star in the making, he opted for a stage name later, proclaiming himself the first emperor of Qin. With a moniker like that, it's clear he wasn't planning to play nice. The Qin state, located in the western part of this anarchic chessboard, was like a scrappy underdog with the tenacity of a terrier and the bite to match. Unlike its more cultured and established neighbors, Qin was a bit rough around the edges, a backwater kingdom with a serious chip on its shoulder. But this was precisely what made it formidable. It was far enough from the cultural centers to avoid their endless bureaucracy, but close enough to learn from their mistakes. Now, let's talk about the neighbors. There were Zhao, Wei, Han, Chu, Yan, and Kai, each with their own ambitions, armies, and agendas. It's like a reality show where everyone is an ambitious ruler with dreams of grandeur, yet only one could wear the crown. But Qin Shi Huang was not content with mere participation. He had a vision, a singular obsession, to end the centuries-long feud and unify China under one banner. If you think this sounds like the plot of a blockbuster movie, you wouldn't be far off. But unlike Hollywood, there were no stunt doubles, just real battles with real stakes. Ying Zheng ascended the throne as King of Qin in 246 BCE at the ripe old age of 13. Let's pause there for a second. Most 13-year-olds today are mastering video games and dreading math homework. But this kid was busy strategizing how to bring about the first Chinese empire. Talk about a childhood like no other. Under the guardianship of the capable and cunning Lu Buwei, the young king learned the art of war and governance. Lu Buwei was a former merchant turned chancellor, making him the kind of mentor who knew the value of both barter and battlefield. The Qin state's success wasn't just thanks to Qin Shi Huang's personal ambition. It was also due to some savvy political and military strategies. The Qin were the pioneers of legalism, a philosophy that emphasized strict laws and harsh punishments. Think of it as the ultimate, tough-love approach to governance. This no-nonsense ideology was spearheaded by the influential Lai Si, who became Qin's chancellor and later the architect of its centralized bureaucracy. He believed that humans were inherently selfish and needed to be kept in line with an iron fist. Not exactly a warm and fuzzy outlook, but it sure got results. Qin's military was another force to reckon with. It had the manpower, thanks to its rigorous conscription policy, and the technology, boasting innovations like the crossbow. They also had something of a secret weapon: spies. Yes, long before they were glamorous figures in tuxedos, spies were doing the dirty work of gathering intelligence, sowing discord, and making sure Qin's enemies never saw the ambush coming. The conquest of the other states was a methodical and brutal process. First, there was Han, the smallest and weakest, which fell in 230 BCE. Like a domino effect, Zhao followed in 228 BCE, then Wei in 225 BCE, and Chu in 223 BCE. Yan fell in 222 BCE. And finally, Kai, the last holdout, was defeated in 221 BCE. With each conquest, Qin Shi Huang tightened his grip, employing strategies that ranged from outright military force to clever diplomacy and psychological warfare. One could say that his unification of China was less about sheer force and more about knowing when to strike, or when to wait for his enemies to make a blunder. And if they didn't, well, that's what spies and subterfuge were for. Qin Shi Huang was adept at turning rival leaders against one another, exploiting their weaknesses, and then swooping in to claim victory. Now, it's easy to romanticize this story as a triumph of vision and strategy over chaos. But let's not forget the cost. The wars and unification efforts led to massive loss of life and suffering. Villages were razed, families torn apart, and entire populations displaced. The Qin were not known for their mercy, and their heavy-handed methods left a trail of devastation. Yet, in the grand tapestry of history, these harsh realities are often overshadowed by the grandeur of empire building. Qin Shi Huang's legacy is a mixed bag, a visionary leader who laid the foundations for what would become modern China, but also a ruler whose draconian measures and iron-fisted rule left deep scars. So, as we marvel at his achievements, let's also remember the human cost, the price paid by countless nameless individuals who lived and died under his reign. And that's just the beginning. With the kingdom finally unified, Qin Shi Huang's ambitions didn't stop at mere political consolidation. No, his dreams were as colossal as the Great Wall he would soon begin constructing. But that's a saga for another time. For now, let's leave Qin Shi Huang at the pinnacle of his hard-won success, a ruler who turned a patchwork of warring states into the first Chinese empire, ready to etch his name in the annals of history, one conquest at a time. And so, with China finally unified under his iron grip, Qin Shi Huang found himself at the helm of a freshly minted empire, a realm that spanned roughly what today we would call a mapmaker's nightmare. But this wasn't just about basking in the glow of conquest. No, our man had bigger fish to fry, or perhaps more accurately, bigger books to balance. Because being an emperor wasn't just about waving swords and shouting orders. It was about systematizing chaos, welding the disparate pieces of his empire into a single, functioning machine. And for that, he needed reforms, lots of them. Enter the age of standardization, where Qin Shi Huang's penchant for order met his empire's need for unity. He understood that if his empire were to be more than a fleeting mosaic of conquered territories, it had to speak the same language, literally and figuratively. So, he set out to standardize weights, measures, and even currency, transforming everyday transactions into a uniform experience across the land. It was less about the romantic allure of uniformity and more about the ruthless efficiency that could be achieved when everyone was on the same page. Metaphorically, at least, since books weren't exactly Amazon Prime material back then. Let's talk numbers. Before Qin, you'd have found a dizzying array of weights and measures across the land, a bureaucratic migraine waiting to happen. Imagine trying to trade a bushel of grain when a bushel could mean anything from a generous helping to a scant handful, depending on where you were standing. Qin Shi Huang's solution was to create a standardized system, using units like the shu for volume and the jin for weight, which were enforced empire-wide. Think of it as the ancient Chinese version of the metric system, but with more scrolls and fewer calculators. And then there was the small matter of currency. Back then, coins came in all shapes and sizes, often resembling miniature art pieces more than standardized tender. Qin Shi Huang introduced a unified currency, a neat little round coin with a square hole in the middle, perfect for stringing together. A practical invention if you ever found yourself in need of an abacus substitute. This currency reform wasn't just about making trade easier. It was about control. With one currency, the emperor could better manage taxes, trade, and most importantly, assert his dominance over an empire that was still finding its feet. Or rather, its footing on a slippery slope of newly imposed order. But let's not sugarcoat things. These reforms weren't implemented out of the goodness of Qin Shi Huang's heart. They were a pragmatic necessity, a means to solidify power and control. He wasn't exactly winning any popularity contests. In fact, the emperor's centralization efforts were often met with resistance, as local rulers and merchants saw their own influence wane. His response? Well, let's just say it wasn't a gentle reminder or a diplomatic terre-à-terre. More often, it involved a not-so-subtle nudge, involving military force and those aforementioned harsh legalist philosophies. Compliance was non-negotiable, and dissent was met with consequences that made a modern tax audit look like a day at the spa. While the empire's internal systems were being whipped into shape, Qin Shi Huang's ambitions stretched far beyond administrative minutiae. Enter the Great Wall of China, or as it was known back then, the Wanli Changcheng, the 10,000-li-long wall. This wasn't just a vanity project or an attempt to get into the Guinness World Records. It was a strategic move to safeguard his new empire from the pesky nomadic tribes lurking in the northern steppes, the perennial thorn in any Chinese ruler's side. The wall was a colossal undertaking, stretching over 500 miles, though back then it was more of a patchwork quilt of fortifications than the continuous marvel we think of today. It required an army of laborers, an estimated 300 000 of them, including conscripted soldiers, peasants, and unfortunately, a fair number of prisoners. The construction process was neither gentle nor forgiving. The terrain was harsh, the conditions brutal, and the work relentless. It said that the wall was built on the bones of those who perished during its construction, a grim reminder that monumental achievements often come with monumental costs. Financially, the wall was a drain on the empire's coffers. Resources were funneled into its construction at the expense of other public needs, leading to increased taxes and forced labor. If Qin Shi Huang had a motto, it might well have been no pain, no gain, though it's safe to say the pain was disproportionately felt by his subjects. Yet, in the grand chess game of empire building, the wall was a piece Qin Shi Huang wasn't willing to sacrifice. It was a testament to his determination, or perhaps his paranoia, that no stone was left unturned in his quest for absolute security. Qin Shi Huang's love affair with bureaucracy and brickwork was rivaled only by his obsession with immortality, but we're not quite there yet. For now, let's just say that while the emperor was busy reshaping his empire, he was also laying the groundwork for his next big adventure, the pursuit of eternal life. But that's a tale for another day. For the moment, Qin Shi Huang was content to be the architect of a new China, one standardized unit and stone at a time, even if it meant earning the ire of his beleaguered populace. Because, if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that visionary leaders rarely worry about being adored in their own time. They're too busy building walls and empires, sometimes on the backs of others, but always with an eye toward the future. As Qin Shi Huang surveyed his newly minted empire, he shifted his gaze from the earthly to the eternal. After all, what's the point of building an empire if you can't stick around to enjoy it forever? This is where the emperor's grand ambitions took a detour from the practical to the downright peculiar, a detour that led him straight into the arms of alchemists and mystics promising the proverbial fountain of youth. Spoiler alert, turning to alchemy for immortality makes about as much sense as trying to charge your smartphone with a potato. Yet here we are. The pursuit of eternal life was not just a hobby for Qin Shi Huang. It was his obsession. And like many obsessions, it was both fascinating and fatal. The emperor's entourage of alchemists, always eager to impress, concocted a range of immortality potions, with mercury pills taking center stage. Yes, you heard that right. Mercury, the liquid metal that's toxic enough to make your health app scream in horror. In an irony that would be comedic if it weren't so tragic, Qin Shi Huang's quest for immortality probably hastened his demise. Mercury poisoning anyone, but let's not dig too deep into the emperor's questionable diet just yet. First, we have to appreciate the sheer paranoia that drove him to such lengths. As someone who had clawed his way to the top through sheer force of will, Qin Shi Huang was understandably wary of what, or who, lurked in the shadows. After all, nothing says, "I trust you," like a heavily guarded palace and a penchant for purges. The emperor's paranoia wasn't without reason. The Warring States period had taught him that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. So, in a move that would make even the most draconian security advisor nod in approval, he initiated a series of purges to rid his court and country of potential threats. It was less about who you knew and more about who might know you, if you catch my drift. The exact number of victims is lost to history, but let's just say the turnover rate in his administration would put any modern corporation to shame. Now, onto the infamous book burning. Was this a case of bibliophobia or something more strategic? In 213 BCE, Qin Shi Huang decreed that all books not related to agriculture, medicine, or the history of the Qin state be torched. The official narrative was that he wanted to unify thought and prevent dissent, a classic case of my way or the fire way. Yet, beneath the surface, it was also about erasing the past, rewriting history to ensure that only the Qin dynasty's narrative survived. Critics? What critics? Burn the books, burn the dissent. Of course, obliterating texts wasn't just about censorship. It was about control. By destroying historical records from other states, Qin Shi Huang aimed to erase any recollection of a time when other kingdoms held power. The emperor wanted people to believe that history began with him. A little narcissistic, sure, but when you're the first emperor, rewriting the past is just another Tuesday. Let's not forget the scholars, either. The intellectuals who dared to question or criticize the regime didn't just lose their books. Some lost their heads, or were buried alive. depending on which historian you ask. Estimates suggest that around 460 scholars met such a fate, a chilling reminder that intellectual freedom was as foreign to Qin Shi Huang as a quiet weekend. These actions were not just the whims of a tyrant. They were the calculated moves of a ruler who saw threats at every turn. Whether those threats were real or imagined is beside the point. The emperor's reign was marked by a relentless drive to consolidate power, even if it meant stifling creativity and innovation. After all, a unified empire with a unified narrative was less likely to rebel. Yet, in his quest to control history, Qin Shi Huang overlooked a crucial detail: the resilience of human memory. Stories of the past were passed down orally, whispered in the shadows, and inscribed in secret. The emperor may have lit the fires of censorship, but he couldn't extinguish the human spirit's desire to remember and recount. And so, despite his best efforts, the tales of the warring states and the scholars' wisdom survived, a testament to the enduring power of knowledge. In the end, Qin Shi Huang's legacy is a study in contrasts. Here was a man who unified a fractured land, standardized its systems, and left behind monumental achievements like the Great Wall and the Terracotta Army. Yet, he was also a ruler whose fear of death and desire for control led to actions that were as destructive as they were visionary. His reign was a paradox, a time of great unification and great division, of lasting innovations and lasting scars. As we look back on his life, it's tempting to see Qin Shi Huang as a cautionary tale, a reminder that the pursuit of power and immortality can lead even the greatest leaders astray. Or perhaps he's the ultimate example of the aphorism, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Either way, his story is far from over. The emperor may have failed to achieve immortality in the literal sense, but through his legacy, he lives on, a complex figure whose ambitions shape the course of history. And with that, we leave Qin Shi Huang on the precipice of another grand undertaking. Because while he may not have found the elixir of life, he was on the verge of creating something that would outlast even the most potent potion, a tomb fit for an emperor. But that's a mystery for another chapter. For now, let's ponder the peculiarities of a ruler who tried to conquer time itself, only to find that some things can't be tamed, not even by the first emperor of China. As Qin Shi Huang turned his attention to constructing an eternal resting place fit for a conqueror, the empire he had so meticulously pieced together was starting to resemble a precarious game of Jenga. On the surface, the Qin dynasty seemed monolithic, a testament to the emperor's grand vision. But beneath the veneer of unity, discontent simmered like a tea kettle on the verge of boiling over. Let's talk about the atmosphere in China during Qin Shi Huang's reign. If you were a commoner, life was less about the glory of a unified empire and more about surviving the emperor's draconian policies. The centralization of power came with a hefty price tag, one paid in the blood, sweat, and tears of his subjects. Remember those standardizations of weights, measures, and currency? They were brilliant moves for control, but left many local economies gasping for air like fish on dry land. When trade suffers, so do the people, and resentment festers. The emperor's obsession with building projects wasn't doing anyone's wallet any favors either. The Great Wall, the extensive road networks, and his elaborate mausoleum required massive resources. Qin Shi Huang had a knack for turning every able-bodied citizen into part of his workforce, whether they liked it or not. It's estimated that hundreds of thousands, if not millions, were conscripted for these monumental tasks. This wasn't just a weekend DIY project. It was a backbreaking ordeal that took many lives and left families destitute. Speaking of destitution, let's dive into the economic context. The Qin dynasty's tax policies were as unforgiving as a hangover after cheap wine. Heavy taxes were levied to fund the empire's ambitious projects and military campaigns. Peasants, already living on the edge, found themselves pushed further into poverty. When the harvests failed or natural disasters struck, the situation went from grim to dire. It's no wonder whispers of rebellion started echoing through the countryside. And whisper they did. By 209 BCE, the undercurrent of dissatisfaction began to swell into something more tangible. Enter Chen Sheng and Wu Guang, two minor officials who became unlikely catalysts for change. Stationed in the far reaches of the empire, these men were ordered to mobilize troops to quell a rebellion. But when heavy rains delayed their journey, they found themselves in a precarious position. In Qin Shi Huang's world, being late was a capital offense. Faced with certain execution for tardiness, they decided to throw caution and loyalty to the wind. Chen Sheng and Wu Guang's rebellion was a desperate gamble, but it tapped into a deep well of discontent. They rallied an army of fellow disgruntled citizens, and before long, the rebellion spread like wildfire. Their rallying cry that the heavens had withdrawn their mandate from the Qin emperor. In ancient China, the mandate of heaven wasn't just a catchy slogan, it was the divine right to rule. Lose it, and you might as well start packing your bags. This uprising wasn't an isolated incident. Across the empire, others saw an opportunity to shake off the yoke of Qin oppression. Liu Bang, a former peasant, and Xiang Yu, a nobleman with a penchant for military strategy, began raising their own armies. These were not the elite warriors of the imperial corps, but farmers and laborers who had grown weary of Qin Shi Huang's iron-fisted control. It was a classic case of the underdogs rising up, a Rocky Balboa moment if Rocky had swords instead of boxing gloves. The dominoes were starting to fall, and the Qin dynasty's centralized power structure began to crumble under the weight of its own inflexibility. The emperor's policies, designed to control and unify, had instead sown the seeds of rebellion. The empire was vast, but its grip was slipping. The more Qin Shi Huang tightened his hold, the more provinces slipped through his fingers. Now, let's talk about communication, or the lack thereof. In an empire that spanned thousands of miles, relaying information was a logistical nightmare. The roads were long, the terrain unforgiving, and the threat of ambush ever-present. By the time news of a rebellion reached the imperial center, it was often too late to mount an effective response. The emperor's world was one where delay could mean disaster, and in this case, it did. This wasn't just a tale of logistics gone awry. It was a testament to the fragility of power built on fear. Qin Shi Huang's harsh methods had created a populace that obeyed out of terror rather than loyalty. And fear, as it turns out, isn't the most stable foundation for an empire. When the fear began to fade, the people rose. It's easy to romanticize the idea of rebellion as a noble struggle against tyranny, but let's not forget the chaos and bloodshed that followed. Uprisings are rarely neat affairs, and this was no exception. Villages burned, families were torn apart, and society was plunged back into the uncertainty it had briefly escaped. Yet this chaos was also a catalyst, a necessary upheaval that paved the way for change. So there we have it. Qin Shi Huang's empire was less the unbreakable fortress he envisioned, and more a house of cards, precariously balanced and vulnerable to the slightest breeze of dissent. His policies had left a legacy of resentment, turning Qin from a symbol of unity into a byword for oppression. The emperor may have unified China, but in doing so, he had also sown the seeds of its division. And as the rebellions rippled across the land, the emperor himself was occupied with matters of mortality, still searching for that elusive elixir of life. But mortality waits for no emperor, and soon, Qin Shi Huang would have to face the very real consequences of his earthly pursuits. Yet, as we'll see, his legacy would live on in ways even he could not have foreseen. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that the ripples of one man's ambitions can echo through the ages, long after the man himself is gone. But that's a tale for another chapter. For now, let's leave the first emperor on the brink of his final journey, a ruler whose iron grip on power was slipping, even as he sought to defy the ultimate authority, time itself. As the sun set on Qin Shi Huang's reign, it seemed the emperor's iron grip was finally meeting its match, not in battle, but in biology. In 210 BCE, while on a quest for immortality that included more mercury pills than anyone should casually consume, Qin Shi Huang died. His death, shrouded in secrecy, sparked a game of telephone gone horribly wrong. Thanks to the slow-moving communication systems of the time, news of his demise was delayed, giving court officials a head start on their succession schemes. Hu Lai Si and Zhao Gao, two names that history remembers with a sneer. Together, they orchestrated a cover-up that could make modern spin doctors look like amateurs. The duo decided that Qin Shi Huang's death should remain under wraps until they could get his preferred successor, Hu Hai, onto the throne. How did they keep an emperor's death a secret during a road trip? Simple. They loaded his carriage with salted fish to mask the smell. Let's just say the journey back to the capital wasn't exactly a scenic tour. In the chaos that followed, the throne went not to the capable eldest son, Fusu, but to Huai, his younger brother, a decision that can be summed up as an epic blunder. Huai, posthumously known as Qin Ershi, was less an emperor and more a puppet, manipulated by Zhao Gao like a marionette with strings in all the wrong places. Huai's reign was a masterclass in mismanagement. He lacked his father's vision and ruthlessness, turning the empire into a cautionary tale about the perils of nepotism. Under his rule, the empire devolved into a bureaucratic circus, with Zhao Gao acting as the ringleader. It was Zhao Gao who nudged the emperor into disastrous policies, further alienating an already disgruntled populace. In a move that should have come with a drumroll, Zhao Gao famously tested the court's loyalty by presenting a deer and calling it a horse. Those who dared to correct him found themselves either silenced or conveniently disappeared. Apparently, in the Qin court, seeing was not believing. Believing was seeing, especially if you wanted to keep your head. Meanwhile, the empire's cracks widened into chasms. The rebellions Qin Shi Huang had suppressed with sheer force now erupted like a bad case of acne. Remember Chen Sheng and Wu Guang? Their rebellion had lit the fuse, and the powder keg was ready to blow. As the uprisings gained momentum, local leaders seized the opportunity to break free from Qin's oppressive yoke. The chaos of the Warring States period seemed poised for an encore performance, and the Qin state was fresh out of tickets. The domino effect was swift and unforgiving. In 207 BCE, Liu Bang, the future founder of the Han Dynasty, seized control of the Qin capital, Xianyang. His victory was the closing act of the Qin dynasty's short, tumultuous reign. The empire that Qin Shi Huang had forged through blood and fire was now a cautionary tale etched in ashes. Huai, incapable of navigating the political labyrinth, met a fittingly tragic end, forced to commit suicide by Zhao Gao. Yet even puppeteers have their day of reckoning. Zhao Gao, having overplayed his hand, was assassinated by Qin loyalists. In the end, the puppet master went down with his marionette. But before we chalk up the Qin dynasty as a mere historical footnote, let's pause to examine its legacy. Despite its short lifespan, the Qin dynasty was far more than just a chapter in a history textbook. It was a revolutionary force that left an indelible mark on China. Qin Shi Huang's obsession with standardization wasn't just about control, it was about creating cohesion. The unified system of weights, measures, and currency became the bedrock on which future dynasties would build. The Great Wall, though a financial sinkhole, set the precedent for fortifications that would protect China for centuries. And let's not forget the centralized bureaucracy, which, despite its heavy-handedness, laid the groundwork for an administrative structure that would endure long after the Qin had crumbled. Perhaps most enduring was the idea of a unified China itself. Qin Shi Huang's vision of a single empire resonated through the ages, serving as a blueprint for subsequent rulers. The notion that China's strength lay in its unity would become a guiding principle, a national ethos that outlasted the dynasty's brutal methods. Qin might have fallen, but its impact was anything but fleeting. The Han Dynasty, which rose from the Qin's ashes, adopted and adapted many of its predecessors' innovations, ensuring that the Qin's legacy was more than just a cautionary tale about mercury pills and tyrannical rule. In a twist of fate, Qin Shi Huang did achieve a form of immortality, not through alchemical experiments, but through his contributions to Chinese civilization. His mausoleum, guarded by the enigmatic terracotta army, stands today as a testament to his ambition. These life-sized warriors, each uniquely crafted, were meant to protect him in the afterlife, a grandiose gesture that speaks to his enduring obsession with life beyond death. Yet, they also symbolize the remarkable artistry and logistical prowess of an empire that could mobilize resources on such a scale. So, what do we make of Qin Shi Huang, the emperor who unified a patchwork of warring states, built monumental walls, and sought eternal life with more gusto than good sense? His story is a tapestry woven with ambition, paranoia, and innovation. It's the tale of an empire that rose and fell with meteoric speed, leaving in its wake a legacy that would shape the Middle Kingdom for millennia. The Qin dynasty may have burned bright and fast, but its embers ignited a future that was both inspired and haunted by its past. As we close the book on the Qin, let's remember it not just as a cautionary tale, but as a chapter in human history that reminds us of the complexity of power. It's a story of visionaries and villains, of reforms that reshaped a world and the hubris that threatened to undo it all. And while Qin Shi Huang may have failed to conquer time, his legacy endures, a testament to the enduring power of ambition and the indelible mark it leaves on the annals of history. You're standing in the thick of it, the medieval market, where chaos is king and distraction is the court jester. It's a cacophony of shouting vendors and clinking coins, and amidst this symphony of commerce, you're just another cog in the wheel of trade. Your feet are firmly planted on cobblestones that have borne the weight of countless traders before you, and you're ready to dive into the action, bartering everything from silk to saffron. Let's address the elephant in the room. Medieval merchants weren't exactly living the fairy tale life you might have read about in some over-glossy historical novels. Sure, there were silks and spices, but it wasn't all exotic voyages and treasure chests. In reality, the life of a merchant was more akin to being an early adopter of hustle culture. If you're imagining yourself as a kind of Marco Polo, it's time for a reality check. Most days were about as glamorous as a soggy wool tunic, and if you've ever tried to haggle over the price of grain, you know it's not exactly the stuff of legends. Now, let's talk goods. You're dealing in a dizzying array of products that would make a modern-day supermarket look like a corner store. Silk from China, spices from India, furs from the Baltic, and wine from France. Every item has its own backstory and its special place in the economic tapestry. The silk you're fingering right now, it might have traveled over 4,000 miles via the Silk Road through the hands of countless traders, each taking their cut before it finally landed here, ready for you to make your markup. But why does all this matter? Well, the goods are more than just products, they're power. Silk wasn't just for fancy clothes, it was a status symbol. Wearing it meant you had connections, wealth, and most importantly, influence. Spices, on the other hand, were nothing short of magic. They could make a bland meal palatable, preserve food, and even, allegedly, cure ailments. So when you're trading in spices, you're not just selling flavor, you're selling the promise of health and longevity. Now, let's dispel some myths about your job. Being a merchant meant long hours and even longer journeys. Forget the romantic notion of leisurely strolls in the market square. You were more likely to be found haggling over a shipment of peppercorns. Packing up your wares wasn't a quaint activity. It required a strategy that would make a Tetris champion proud. Loading your goods onto a ship or a cart was all about maximizing space and minimizing loss. And if you think modern logistics are complex, imagine trying to coordinate shipments with nothing but parchment and ink. We're talking about an era where the average sea voyage could take weeks, and that's if the weather was on your side. Oh, and let's not forget the pirates. While modern entrepreneurs worry about market volatility, you had to watch for literal waves of trouble. One storm could send your entire investment to the ocean floor, faster than you can say insurance policy. And even if you managed to avoid the high seas, bandits on the road were more than happy to relieve you of your goods if you dared to travel without protection. The logistics were daunting, sure, but the rewards could be immense. A successful merchant could become as influential as the nobles who wore the silks and spices they provided. But before you start dreaming of your own castle, remember that most merchants lived modestly, reinvesting their earnings to keep the business afloat. The real wealth was in the network you built. Knowing the right people, the ones who could offer protection, favorable terms, or insider information, was worth more than a chest full of gold. But what about the marketplace itself, your arena of commerce? Medieval markets were the original melting pots. They were the social media platforms of their day, where ideas spread as quickly as goods. You'd hear languages from all over the known world, see faces from different continents, and smell foods that hinted at lands afar. The market was a microcosm of the medieval world, where trade wasn't just an exchange of goods, but a sharing of cultures. Despite the romanticized image of the medieval market as a place of endless opportunity, it was also a cutthroat environment. Competition was fierce, and it was every man, and occasionally woman, for themselves. You had to be sharp with numbers, and even sharper with your tongue. A keen eye for quality and a knack for negotiation were your best tools, and sometimes a little charm and charisma didn't hurt either. And let's not ignore the bureaucratic hoops you had to jump through. Local authorities had their hands in every part, demanding taxes, tolls, and tariffs at every turn. You'd spend as much time managing these relationships and ensuring compliance as you did trading. Negotiating with city officials was an art form, requiring the finesse of a courtier and the patience of a saint. So, as you wrap up another day in the market, counting your coins and plotting your next move, remember, being a medieval merchant was a balancing act. It was a life of grit and grind, where every transaction was a gamble and every cargo a potential windfall or a catastrophic loss. But it was also a life of connection, of bridging cultures and continents and weaving the world together through trade. As you lay down your head, exhausted from the day's toil, you're not just any merchant. You're part of a legacy that shaped the world, one transaction at a time. And so, your head hits the straw pillow, but sleep, not so fast. Tomorrow, you'll embark on the trade routes, a grandiose term for what are essentially dusty tracks, fraught with peril and possibility. These paths of prosperity are as much your office as the market stalls are, and they're about as organized as a medieval feast, chaotic but somehow functional. Let's face it, medieval travel wasn't exactly glamping. You didn't just grab your compass and go like a backpacker with wanderlust and Wi-Fi. No, you were setting off into a world where maps were more suggestion than science, and the landscape itself could change your fortunes. First stop on our whirlwind tour, the Silk Road. This isn't just any road, it's the veritable superhighway of the Middle Ages, stretching over 6,000 miles from China to the Mediterranean. It's like the Route 66 of the ancient world, but with fewer diners and more camels. Think of it as a concert tour, but instead of band t-shirts, you're moving silk, spices, and all the accoutrements of wealth. The Silk Road wasn't just a trade route. It was a tapestry of cultures, languages, and occasionally misunderstandings. You had to be as fluent in diplomacy as you were in currency exchange. Now, let's debunk a myth. The Silk Road wasn't a single, dusty trail lined with merchants in flowing robes. It was an intricate web of routes, more like a choose-your-own-adventure novel, where each path had its own set of challenges and rewards. And while the name suggests a romantic vision of silken caravans, it was just as much about mundane goods like grain and livestock. Yes, those glamorous spices and silks might have been the headliners, but the supporting acts were just as crucial to the plot. Speaking of which, forget about the glamorous tales of Marco Polo gallivanting about with nothing but a satchel and a smile. In reality, traveling these routes was akin to enrolling in the school of hard knocks. You dealt with bandits who weren't just after your goods, they were after your life. A merchant's best friend was a hired guard, and the more muscle you could afford, the better your chances of making it out unscathed. Bad weather could turn a prosperous journey into a mud-soaked disaster, and bureaucratic roadblocks, like tolls and taxes, were as plentiful as flea markets along the way. Ah, the joys of medieval bureaucracy. Imagine navigating a maze of tariffs and tolls with nothing but your wits, and a parchment filled with scribbles and seals. Every city you passed demanded its cut, and some were more inventive in their demands than others. If you thought modern tax codes were convoluted, try a medieval toll system that changed with the whims of local lords. It was like playing a game of Monopoly where everyone but you owned Boardwalk and Park Place. But wait, there's more. Let's not forget the exhilarating world of medieval finance. Back then, currency exchange was less about economics and more like playing a never-ending shell game. Each region had its own currency, and you needed the patience of a saint and the cunning of a fox to keep up. Imagine trying to calculate exchange rates without a calculator or Google. A florin in Florence wasn't worth the same in Frankfurt, and if you couldn't do the math, well, you'd better hope you were good at charming your way out of a bad deal. Here's a reality check. Currency exchange could make or break your journey. It wasn't just about losing a few coins in a bad trade. It was about losing your livelihood. You had to be sharp, always keeping one eye on the scales and the other on the ledger. And let's admit it, the real currency here was trust. Building relationships with other traders, knowing who could be trusted and who was likely to hand you a bag of rocks instead of gold, was as critical as any number on a ledger. Despite the gritty realities, there's no denying the romance of the trade routes. These paths were the lifelines of empires, the veins through which culture, technology, and ideas flowed as freely as goods. It was on these roads that you'd encounter not just other merchants, but pilgrims, diplomats, and sometimes even the odd scholar on a quest for knowledge. Each journey was a chance to connect, to learn, and to grow your little piece of the world. And so, as you lean into the rhythm of the road, with the clatter of hooves and the creak of wagon wheels as your soundtrack. You're not just moving goods. You're part of a grand narrative. You're weaving together the threads of different worlds, creating a tapestry of trade that would define the medieval era. But don't get too comfortable. There are still plenty of twists and turns to navigate. The road ahead is long, and the challenges are many, but the promise of riches and renown is just too tantalizing to resist. Tomorrow, we'll dive deeper into those local routes, the unsung heroes of medieval trade. They might not have the same allure as the Silk Road, but they're just as vital to the story. So, rest up, because the journey is far from over, and the road, as always, is calling. As the dust settles behind the last caravan and the local routes beckon, let's take a moment to appreciate these unsung heroes of medieval trade. We're diving into the world of feudal society, where being a merchant was a bit like juggling flaming torches while riding a unicycle on a tightrope. You had to navigate a landscape as tangled as a Shakespearean plot, complete with guilds, taxes, and royal decrees that could flip your world upside down faster than you can say feudal dues. First up, let's tackle the guilds. Think of them as the original trade unions, but with more power and less paperwork. Guilds were a merchant's best friend and worst enemy rolled into one. They set the rules, controlled the quality of goods, and determined who could sell what, where, and for how much. Imagine trying to open a lemonade stand and finding out you need approval from the Society of Citrus Vendors, who also own the only lemons in town. Yeah, it was like that. But being part of a guild also came with perks, protection, credibility, and a network that could rival LinkedIn minus the spam. Guilds were serious business. In cities like Paris, where the Guild of Paris Butchers wielded more power than a Game of Thrones family, membership wasn't just advisable, it was essential. And getting in wasn't a matter of just paying dues. Oh no, you needed to apprentice, prove your worth, and sometimes even bribe the right people. Once you made it in, you were expected to toe the line. Break the rules, and you'd face fines, expulsion, or worse. In 1382, the tailors of London rebelled against their guild's regulations, and the ensuing crackdown was harsh enough to make modern regulatory scandals look like playground squabbles. But guilds weren't the only players in this medieval game of Monopoly. Taxes were as common as fleas on a mangy dog, and they came in all shapes and sizes. Tolls, tariffs, and tributes. Each city or feudal lord had their own flavor, and boy, did they spice things up. It wasn't just about handing over a few coins. Sometimes you'd be forced to cough up goods, animals, or even your firstborn child. Okay, maybe not the child, but you get the picture. In England, King John was notorious for his creative tax schemes, which included levies on everything from bridge crossings to beard lengths. What about royal decrees? These were the wild cards in your deck, unexpected, unpredictable, and occasionally disastrous. One minute you're enjoying a booming trade in wool, and the next, the king decides that wool trade is banned because he's feuding with a rival lord who happens to own sheep. Merchants in medieval England knew this all too well. The infamous Wool Act of 1275, for instance, imposed hefty taxes on wool exports, causing many merchants to either adapt or perish. It was like playing a high-stakes poker game where the rules changed on a whim, and the dealer was a capricious monarch with a penchant for reshuffling the deck. Yet amid this chaos, some merchants dared to challenge the status quo. Enter Francesco d'Attini, a 14th-century Italian merchant who built an empire that spanned across Europe. D'Attini was a trailblazer, using double-entry bookkeeping to keep his accounts in check, a revolutionary method at the time. It didn't just help him grow his fortune, it also laid the groundwork for modern accounting. But d'Attini's success wasn't just about numbers. He navigated the labyrinth of guilds and taxes with a deftness that would make a modern-day corporate lawyer proud. His secret: relationships. He built a network of alliances, with partners in cities like Avignon and Barcelona, ensuring he always had a foot in the door, no matter the political climate. Of course, breaking the mold sometimes came with consequences. Let's look at the story of Jacob Fugger, the 16th century German merchant and banker who wasn't just rich. He was, I can fund an emperor rich. Fugger didn't play by the rules. He wrote them. He financed the election of Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor, essentially buying influence on a scale that makes today's political donors look like kids with piggy banks. But his audacity had a price. Fugger's actions sparked envy and animosity, earning him enemies in both the church and state. 1519, when the Fuggers were accused of usury, a grave sin in those days, they faced serious backlash. Yet Fugger's wealth and connections allowed him to weather the storm, proving that sometimes, in the game of medieval commerce, fortune really did favor the bold. But let's not romanticize it too much. For every Datini and Fugger, there were countless merchants who tried to break free from the system, only to be crushed by it. Take the Hanseatic League, the powerful trading confederation in Northern Europe. They held a monopoly over the Baltic trade, and woe betide anyone who tried to circumvent their control. Merchants who dared to trade independently often found themselves blacklisted, their goods seized, or worse, their ships sunk. So, what did it mean to be a merchant in a feudal society? It was a dance with danger, where every step could lead to fortune or ruin. You had to be as cunning as a fox, as shrewd as a chess master, and as resilient as a cockroach. You needed to know when to bend the knee and when to stand your ground, a balancing act worthy of the finest acrobat. And while the guilds, taxes, and decrees created a web that could ensnare the unwary, they also wove a complex tapestry of commerce and culture that defined the medieval landscape. The merchants were the threads that held it all together, connecting distant lands and diverse peoples, even as they navigated the treacherous waters of medieval corporate politics. So next time you're haggling over the price of a latte or complaining about paperwork, spare a thought for those medieval merchants who walked a fine line between prosperity and peril. They were the original hustlers, the pioneers of trade, and the unsung heroes of a world that was as unpredictable as it was fascinating. But don't get too comfortable. There's still more to uncover as we continue our journey through the tangled maze of medieval commerce. The road ahead is long, and the stories, as always, are waiting to be told. So, we've navigated the dizzying maze of guilds and taxes, but let's shift the spotlight to something a bit more personal. You're a medieval merchant, and your life isn't just about balancing ledgers and dodging tolls. No, it's also about family. Your very own medieval sitcom, minus the laugh track, but with all the drama. Welcome to the world where your spouse isn't just your better half. They're your business partner, your confidant, and occasionally your fiercest competitor. First things first, forget whatever romantic notion you have of the solitary merchant hero. The truth is, medieval trade was a family affair. Think of it as the original mom and pop shop, but on steroids, with a side of medieval intrigue. Your spouse wasn't just there to keep the home fires burning. Oh no, they were right there in the thick of it, managing the shop, negotiating deals, and sometimes even traveling with you. Take Margherita Datini, wife of Francesco Datini, our double-entry bookkeeping virtuoso. When Francesco was off gallivanting across Europe, Margherita wasn't just knitting by the fireside. She was running the show, handling business affairs with a deftness that would put many a modern CEO to shame. And let's not forget that the family business wasn't just a quaint little enterprise. It was your family's lifeline, the medieval equivalent of having your eggs, your entire chicken, and the coop in one very precarious basket. If the business thrived, so did you and your kin. If it floundered, well, let's just say the medieval safety net was more like a gaping hole. So everyone pitched in, parents, siblings, children. It was all hands on deck, and sometimes the family that traded together stayed together, or tore each other apart over a bad batch of wool. Speaking of wool, let's talk social mobility. Trade was one of those rare medieval ladders that let you climb out of your social stratum if you played your cards right. It was a blessing and a curse, like winning a medieval lottery where the prize was a better life, but the odds were stacked against you. Sure, you could rise from a humble peddler to a wealthy merchant prince, like the illustrious Medici family, who went from selling wool to practically owning Florence. But for every Medici, there were countless others whose fortunes were as fleeting as a mayfly on a hot summer day. The merchant's life was a constant balancing act. On one hand, you had the opportunity to transcend your birth status and rub elbows with nobility. On the other, you were always one bad deal away from ruin. You see, the same network that could propel you to dizzying heights could also be your downfall. Remember Jacob Fugger, our financial daredevil. His rise to power was as much about strategic marriages and alliances as it was about cold, hard cash. But with great power came great responsibility and even greater risks. One wrong move, and those alliances could turn into vendettas faster than you can say hostile takeover. And let's not sugarcoat it. Being a merchant was often synonymous with being an opportunist. You had to have the instincts of a hawk and the patience of a saint. Whether it was seizing a chance to buy low and sell high, or cutting a deal with a rival to corner a market, success wasn't about playing nice. It was about playing smart. If opportunity knocked, you didn't just answer the door. You flung it open and invited opportunity in for a 3-course meal. But let's bust the myth of the merchant as a lone wolf, blazing a trail through uncharted markets. The reality: merchants were more like the original LinkedIn influencers, building networks that would make modern social media moguls green with envy. It wasn't just what you knew, but who you knew, and how well you could work those connections. Contracts weren't signed on dotted lines. They were sealed with handshakes, oaths, and sometimes a little something extra under the table. Let's take a peek at the role of merchant spouses. They were the unsung heroes behind many a successful venture, often managing finances, supervising trade routes, and ensuring the family business didn't go belly up while their better halves were off chasing profits. In some cases, these spouses were the real brains behind the operation. Such was the case with Hildegard of Bingen, not just a mystic and composer, but a savvy manager of her abbey's finances, proving that women weren't just passive participants in medieval commerce. They were active, influential players. But of course, with great power dynamics come great domestic squabbles. The family business could be a source of tension as everyone jostled for their piece of the pie. Dividing profits, deciding on investments, and mapping out the future of the business were potential flashpoints. And if the business hit a rough patch, it wasn't just the merchant who felt the pinch, it was the entire clan. So, when you hear tales of medieval merchants, remember they weren't just lone adventurers. They were part of a complex web of relationships, each thread as crucial as the next. One thing is certain: the life of a merchant was never dull. It was a tapestry woven with ambition, risk, and occasionally, pure luck. The marketplace was more than a place of commerce. It was a stage where merchants and their families played out the drama of life, love, and loss. And while the road was fraught with peril, it was also filled with promise, each turn offering a new chance to rise, to fall, and perhaps to rise again. So, as we wrap up this chapter of our medieval saga, keep in mind that the world of the merchant was as intricate as the finest lace, each thread telling a story of struggle and triumph, deceit and loyalty. And while the myths of lone merchant heroes may have their charm, the real story lies in the networks, the families, and the relentless pursuit of opportunity that defined an era. But don't get too comfortable. There's still more to explore as we delve deeper into the labyrinth of medieval trade. The journey is far from over, and there are more tales waiting to be told. So buckle up, because the adventure continues, and the stories, as always, are just beginning to unfold. So, as we meander through the medieval marketplace of history, let's talk about what all this hustle and bustle means in the grand scheme of things. You know, like the difference between a single brick and the Great Wall of China. But here we're talking the rise of towns and the dawn of capitalism, all thanks to our unsung heroes, the medieval merchants. These folks weren't just hawking wares. They were laying the foundation for the modern economic systems we love to hate today. First up, let's dive into how trade transformed sleepy medieval hamlets into bustling towns. You could say merchants were the urban planners of their day, turning fields of mud into centers of commerce. Take Venice, for instance. It wasn't always the postcard-perfect city of canals and gondolas. In the 9th century, it was just a collection of marshy islands. But by the 13th century, it had morphed into a powerhouse of trade and finance, all thanks to its strategic position as a gateway between East and West. By 1200, Venice's population had swelled to over 60,000, impressive for a city built on stilts. This wasn't just happening in Venice. Throughout Europe, towns sprang up like mushrooms after rain, thanks to the burgeoning trade routes. In 1100, London was home to around 15,000 souls. Fast forward 2 centuries, that number had ballooned to 100,000. These towns weren't just about population growth, they were about a new way of life. Markets became the lifeblood of these communities, attracting artisans, craftsmen, and yes, more merchants. They were the medieval equivalent of Silicon Valley, where innovation met opportunity and fortunes could be made or lost overnight. But all this urban expansion needed a backbone, And that's where our merchants come in. They were the original venture capitalists, injecting life and money into the economy. This wasn't just about selling spices and silks anymore. They were trading in ideas, technology, and culture, sowing the seeds of what would eventually become capitalism. Enter the concept of credit and banking. Merchants needed a way to finance their long, perilous journeys and risky ventures. So, they got creative. Letters of credit and bills of exchange were the medieval precursor to your modern-day credit card, allowing merchants to move money without physically moving cash. This innovation was a game-changer, turning trade into a more reliable and less dangerous endeavor. And let's not forget the infamous Medici family, who took this concept and ran with it. By the 15th century, they had amassed a banking empire that not only funded papal projects, but also influenced European politics. They were like the Rothschilds of the Renaissance, if the Rothschilds also dabbled in art patronage and occasionally got exiled for being too powerful. But capitalism's rise wasn't just about money. It was a social revolution. The merchant class, once considered the riffraff of the medieval world, began to climb the social ladder. They were the nouveau rich who could afford to commission art, build grand homes, and even marry into nobility. This shift was as seismic as a medieval earthquake, challenging the rigid feudal system that had kept everyone neatly in their place. Suddenly, wealth wasn't just about land. It was about trade and the ability to move goods and influence across borders. So, what's the legacy of these medieval merchants? They were the architects of a world where commerce became king and where the individual, not just the aristocracy, could wield power. They laid the groundwork for the interconnected global economy we inhabit today, complete with all its triumphs and tribulations. And as with any legacy, it comes with lessons we can learn, or at least pretend to learn, as we go about our modern lives. For one, the importance of adaptability. Medieval merchants thrived because they could pivot faster than a millennial at a tech startup. When the wool trade took a nosedive, they diversified into silk. When one route was blocked by war, they found another. They were the epitome of resilience, a trait that remains as valuable today as it was back then. And what about innovation? Those merchants were constantly finding new ways to solve old problems, whether it was through the invention of double-entry bookkeeping or the creation of joint stock companies that shared risk and reward. They remind us that necessity is indeed the mother of invention, even if that invention sometimes involves dodging taxes or outwitting bandits. Now, let's debunk a few enduring myths. The life of a medieval merchant wasn't all swashbuckling and silk-lined pockets. It was a grind, a relentless hustle that required grit and often came with more risk than reward. Despite the romantic allure of the open road and the promise of riches, the truth is that many merchants lived on the edge, their fortunes as unpredictable as the weather. Yet, it's this very unpredictability that continues to captivate our imagination. Perhaps it's the allure of adventure, the idea of setting out with nothing but a dream and a cart full of goods, hoping to make your mark on the world. In the end, the medieval merchant's life was a tapestry woven from ambition and adversity, a story of risk and reward that resonates even today. They were the dreamers and the doers, the rebels and the risk-takers, whose legacy is etched into the very fabric of modern society. So, as we close the book on this chapter of history, let's tip our hats to those intrepid souls who dared to trade not just in goods, but in dreams. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you swipe your credit card or negotiate a deal, you'll remember the merchants who walked before you, paving the way for the world as we know it. You're standing at the base of a colossal pyramid, and let's be real, it's the ancient Egyptian equivalent of staring up at the Empire State Building. These stone behemoths didn't just pop up overnight, and they certainly weren't built by some ragtag group of slaves, despite what Hollywood might have you believe. Nope. These towering marvels were the handiwork of a highly skilled and organized labor force. And guess what? You're one of them. Welcome to the world of pyramid construction, where the stakes are high, the stones are heavier than your aunt's fruitcake, and the labor force is as well structured as a modern-day construction crew. Forget the whips and chains fantasy. You're part of an elite team of builders, artisans, and engineers who eat, sleep, and breathe stone masonry. The Egyptians knew a thing or two about keeping their workforce in top shape, and it wasn't just about the paycheck, or in this case, payment in bread, beer, and the occasional slab of meat. You're not just a number here. The workforce is split into crews, often referred to as gangs, and these gangs have cool names like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkora. It sounds like an ancient rock band lineup, but let's not get sidetracked. Each gang is subdivided into smaller units, each with its own set of tasks. Think of it as being part of a well-oiled machine where everyone's got a role, and slacking off isn't an option unless you want to face the wrath of the foreman. Daily life on the construction site is a mix of hard labor and surprisingly effective logistics. You start your day before the sun even thinks about rising, fueled by a breakfast that's heavy on carbs to keep you going. You're not clerking in a standard 9 to 5 here. Shifts can be long and grueling, but there's method to this madness. The Egyptians had a knack for managing massive projects, and they knew that keeping the workforce organized meant fewer delays and more progress. It's a lesson modern-day project managers could learn from. Your accommodations aren't too shabby either. You're housed in a nearby camp, complete with barracks that, while basic, are far from the squalor you might expect. It's not the Ritz, but it's comfortable enough to crash in after a hard day's work. And here's a fun fact. The site even has a healthcare system. That's right, ancient Egypt was ahead of its time with medical care. If you pull a muscle or chip a tooth, there's a medic on hand to patch you up. Archaeologists have found evidence of surgeries and medical treatments that suggest these guys were the real deal, not just quacks with a bone saw. But let's talk numbers, because this whole operation is a logistical marvel. It's estimated that around 20,000 to 30,000 workers were involved in the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza alone. That's a small city's worth of people dedicated to stacking stones in perfect alignment. And these weren't just any stones. The average block weighed about 5 tons, and some of the granite slabs used in the king's chamber tipped the scales at a whopping 80 tons. Moving these bad boys required some serious engineering prowess and a lot of elbow grease. Now, you might be wondering how all of this was funded. Spoiler alert. Pharaohs weren't just sitting on piles of gold, throwing it around like confetti. The economy was largely barter-based, with laborers compensated through a system of rations. Bread, beer, and onions were the staples of your daily diet, and they kept the workforce fueled and ready for action. This wasn't just sustenance. It was a way of life, with each meal serving as a reminder of the communal effort required to construct these awe-inspiring edifices. The social and political factors at play were as complex as the pyramids themselves. Building these monuments wasn't just about creating a fancy tomb for the afterlife. It was a statement of power and divine right. Pharaohs were seen as living gods, and the pyramids were their eternal resting places, designed to ensure their immortality. This divine mandate meant that everyone, from the lowliest laborer to the highest official, was invested in the project's success. It was a national endeavor that united people across different classes and backgrounds in pursuit of a common goal. Sure, the romantic notion of slaves toiling under the desert sun makes for a dramatic tale, but the truth is far more impressive. You're part of a workforce that is well-fed, well-organized, and crucial to one of the greatest architectural achievements in history. The Egyptians were masters of project management and logistics, turning what could have been a chaotic undertaking into a smoothly running operation. So next time you hear that old myth about slaves building the pyramids, you can set the record straight with a smirk and a knowing nod. Because you were there, stacking stones, breaking a sweat, and making history. So, you're part of this ancient construction crew, and you're probably wondering how on earth they managed to move all that stone without modern machinery. Well, let's dive into the logistical nightmare that is pyramid construction. Because if you think your morning commute is a pain, try hauling a few million stones across the desert. First up, the quarrying. Picture this. You're in the limestone quarries of Tura, just a stone's throw, pun intended, from the pyramids. It's here that the bulk of the pyramids, 3 million blocks, weighing in at an average of 5 tons each, are sourced. That's right, a casual 5. 75 million tons of limestone, enough to put your local home improvement store to shame. And we haven't even gotten to the granite yet, which was hauled all the way from Aswan, some 500 miles south of Giza. These granite blocks were the real heavyweights, some tipping the scales at a staggering 80 tons each. Imagine trying to get one of those bad boys into your backyard. Now, let's talk about transportation. Forget about trucks or cranes. We're in ancient Egypt, where manpower and ingenuity are the names of the game. The Egyptians used sledges to drag these massive stones across the desert. And here's the genius part. They would dampen the sand in front of the sledges to reduce friction, because nothing says innovation like turning sand into an ancient slip and slide. This little trick made it about 50% easier to drag the stones, proving that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective. But wait, there's more. To get those granite slabs from Aswan to Giza, they floated them down the Nile on massive barges. Picture a flotilla of stone-laden boats cruising down the river, with the Egyptian sun beating down and the rhythmic chants of workers echoing across the water. It's a scene straight out of a historical epic. And while it sounds romantic, let's be real. It was probably more like a game of ancient Frogger, dodging crocodiles and navigating the river's treacherous currents. Once at the construction site, the real fun began. The Egyptians constructed a series of ramps to hoist these stones into place. Think of these ramps as the ancient world's answer to an escalator. Only instead of a smooth ride to the top, you've got a bunch of sweaty, sunburned workers pushing giant stones uphill. The ramps were made of mud brick and limestone chippings, and they would spiral around the pyramid or run straight up its sides. And while these ramps were effective, they were also temporary, dismantled once the pyramid was completed. Talk about a zero-waste construction policy. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate the engineering prowess that went into stacking these stones. The precision required to align each block is mind-boggling. The Great Pyramid's base, for instance, is nearly perfectly level within just a few centimeters, a feat that would make even the most seasoned modern engineer break out in a nervous sweat. The Egyptians achieved this accuracy using simple tools like plumb barbs and leveling instruments, demonstrating that you don't need a PhD in engineering to build a world wonder, just a lot of patience and a steady hand. And here's where we draw a parallel to modern construction. While today's buildings rely heavily on steel frameworks and concrete, the Egyptians were all about stone. Sure, it's not the most flexible material, but it's durable. I mean, these pyramids have been standing for over 500 years, while some of our modern masterpieces struggle to survive a few decades without a renovation. It's a testament to the Egyptians' understanding of materials and their ability to work with what they had. But why go to all this trouble? What's the payoff? Well, aside from creating a lasting legacy and a tourist attraction that rakes in more Instagram likes than the Eiffel Tower, constructing pyramids was a way to assert power and control. The sheer scale of these projects was a show of strength, a message to both the living and the divine that Egypt was a force to be reckoned with. Plus, it kept the workforce busy and the economy humming, which is always a bonus when you're running a nation. Of course, with great engineering feats come even greater myths. One of the most persistent is the notion that aliens had a hand in building the pyramids. It's an idea that's as entertaining as it is absurd, but it speaks to the awe these structures inspire. The truth is, human ingenuity, fueled by a bit of sweat and a lot of beer, was more than enough to get the job done. And while the alien theory makes for a fun campfire story, the reality is far more impressive. These pyramids are a testament to what we're capable of when we put our minds to it, even if it means lugging a few million tons of stone around in the process. So next time you hear someone waxing poetic about extraterrestrial architects, you can smile knowingly and drop some knowledge about the real heroes of the story, the thousands of workers who turned a pharaoh's dream into a reality. Because at the end of the day, it's not about who did it. It's about the fact that it was done at all. And that, my friend, is a story worth telling. And with that, let's leave the stone-laden sledges and the sun-drenched ramps for now. There's still plenty more to uncover in the world of pyramid construction and a few more myths to bust along the way. Until next time, keep your eyes on the stones and your mind on the marvels of human history. All right, now that we've left the stone sledges and the sun-drenched ramps behind, let's talk about the elephant in the room, or rather, the pyramid in the desert, the economics of it all. Because building these ancient skyscrapers wasn't just about flexing architectural muscles. It was also a massive economic undertaking that would make modern-day Wall Street analysts break out in a cold sweat. First things first, how did they bankroll these monumental projects? Spoiler alert. It wasn't with a giant mound of Egyptian gold. The economy was as much about grain and goods as it was about shiny treasures. In fact, it was a bit like an ancient Kickstarter campaign, where the currency of choice was grain, beer, and bread. These staples formed the backbone of the workers' wages, keeping them fueled and motivated. We're talking about rations that were carefully calculated, typically about 3 to 4 loaves of bread and 2 jugs of beer a day per worker. It sounds like a balanced diet, right? Well, if you're running a marathon while hauling stones, it's exactly what you need. And speaking of resources, let's not forget about the materials. The limestone and granite weren't just lying around waiting to be picked up. Quarrying these stones and transporting them was an operation that required economic savvy and logistical prowess. Picture this. Moving these colossal blocks involved a workforce that was essentially a small city, with all the economic activities that come with it. From the stonemasons to the cooks, everyone was part of the pyramid's economic ecosystem. So, where did all this leave the Egyptian economy? Well, it was a double-edged sword. On one hand, the pyramid projects stimulated economic activity on a scale that's hard to overstate. They provided jobs, fostered trade, and encouraged technological innovation. On the other hand, they were also a massive drain on resources. It's a bit like building a mega sports stadium today. Sure, it creates jobs, but it also costs a fortune and leaves you wondering if it was all worth it when the games are over. Now, you might be asking yourself, why did pharaohs go to such lengths to build these colossal tombs? Was it all just a vanity project? Well, not quite. Sure, there was an element of eternal glory and divine right. After all, pharaohs were seen as gods on earth, and their pyramids were meant to ensure their immortality. But there was also a political and religious rationale. Building these pyramids was a way to unify the nation under a single, awe-inspiring project. It was a reminder of the pharaoh's power and the divine order of the cosmos, which, let's be honest, is a pretty good way to keep everyone in line. But let's dig a little deeper into the numbers. The Great Pyramid of Giza, for instance, is estimated to have taken around 20 years to complete, employing about 20, 000 to 30, 000 workers at any given time. That's a hefty payroll by ancient standards, and the logistics of feeding and housing this workforce were nothing short of a Herculean effort. It's estimated that the daily bread and beer rations alone would have required so much grain and barley that entire agricultural regions were dedicated to keeping the workers fed. It's a bit like having your own personal farm-to-table operation, centuries before it became trendy. The construction of pyramids also had a ripple effect on other sectors of the economy. For starters, it spurred advancements in architecture and engineering that would resonate throughout Egyptian history. It also boosted the craft and trade industries, as skilled artisans were needed to produce the tools, art, and adornments that would fill the pharaoh's tomb. And let's not overlook the political angle. All these efforts reinforced the pharaoh's status and the centralized power of the state, which was crucial in maintaining control over the vast and diverse land of Egypt. Now, here's where things get interesting. While the pyramids are often seen as symbols of eternal life and divine power, they also highlight the fragility of human endeavor. Despite the grandeur of these tombs, they couldn't prevent the eventual decline of the Old Kingdom. The resources and labor poured into these projects could not stop the droughts, famines, and political strife that would eventually lead to the kingdom's downfall. It's a sobering reminder that even the mightiest monuments are no match for the forces of nature and time. As we peel back the layers of pyramid construction, it's clear that these ancient projects were about more than just stacking stones. They were complex economic engines, political statements, and religious symbols all rolled into one. And while the romantic myth of slaves toiling under the lash makes for a captivating story, the reality is far more intricate and impressive. It's a testament to human ingenuity and the lengths we'll go to ensure our legacies stand the test of time, even if it means moving mountains, or in this case, millions of tons of stone. So, as we wrap up this exploration of ancient Egyptian economics, remember that the pyramids are not just relics of the past. They're reminders that our greatest achievements often come with a price, and that the true cost of building a legacy is measured not just in resources, but in human effort and ambition. And with that thought, let's leave the economic intricacies of pyramid construction behind for now. There's still plenty more to uncover in this ancient saga, and a few more myths to debunk along the way. Stay tuned, because the story is far from over. All right, so we've unpacked the economic engine behind pyramid building, but let's dive face first into the myths and legends that have clung to these ancient marvels like an overzealous barnacle. Buckle up, because we're about to debunk some tall tales, and trust me, it's going to be more satisfying than popping bubble wrap. First up, ancient aliens. Yep, the idea that some extraterrestrial Uber drivers dropped by Earth, took a look around, and decided the best use of their technology was to build a few pointy tombs in the desert. It's a theory that's as persistent as it is delightfully quirky. But here's the thing, there's absolutely zero concrete evidence to support it. None. Nada. Zilch. The truth is, the pyramids are a testament to human ingenuity, not otherworldly intervention. Archaeological evidence paints a vivid picture of the real builders, highly organized teams of skilled laborers who knew their way around a chisel and had a knack for logistics that could rival Amazons. Now, why do these alien theories persist? Well, it's not just about the allure of the unknown or our love for a good sci-fi plot. It's also about underestimating the capabilities of ancient civilizations. We look at the pyramids and think, there's no way humans back then could have done this without some help. But they absolutely could, and they did, using a combination of brute force, clever engineering, and sheer determination. Plus, isn't it a bit more flattering to think we're descended from folks who could pull off something this monumental rather than relying on some intergalactic hand-holding? Then there's the curse of the pharaohs, a trope that's been an absolute goldmine for horror movies and Halloween parties. The idea is that anyone who disturbs a pharaoh's tomb will be struck down by a supernatural vengeance. But let's get real, shall we? Most of these curses are just a series of unfortunate events that got spun into a narrative juicier than a soap opera. Take the infamous curse of Tutankhamun. The explorers who opened his tomb in 1922 were rumored to have been cursed, but in reality, most of them lived long, healthy lives. The idea of a curse is spooky and sells newspapers, but in truth, it's more about drama than data. But why do these legends hold such sway? It's simple. They make for captivating stories. Humans are wired for storytelling, and tales of curses and aliens tap into our deepest fears and fascinations. They're the kind of narratives that get passed around the campfire that make us shiver delightfully in our armchairs. Plus, they offer a neat explanation for the inexplicable, a way to wrap our minds around the achievements that seem to defy logic. Let's not forget the allure of mystery. The pyramids are ancient puzzles that we're still piecing together, and where there are gaps in knowledge, myths take root. They're like historical placeholders, filling the void until we uncover the truth. And while science and archaeology have debunked many of these myths, the stories persist because they scratch an itch for wonder and the unknown. Now, let's talk about the role of these myths in popular culture. They become shorthand for the mysterious and the arcane, popping up in everything from blockbuster movies to conspiracy theories. They add a layer of drama and intrigue to the already fascinating story of ancient Egypt. And while they might not hold water historically, they do reflect our fascination with the past and our desire to connect with it in ways that are both thrilling and terrifying. In many ways, these myths are a testament to the power of the pyramids themselves. They loom large not just in the desert, but in our collective imagination, inspiring everything from scholarly debate to the wildest flights of fancy. They remind us that while we've come a long way in understanding our history, there's still much we don't know, and that's both humbling and exciting. So, as we sift through the sands of time, let's keep this in mind. The pyramids are more than just stones piled high in the desert. They're symbols of human achievement, stories carved in stone, and yes, they're the source of some of the most entertaining myths and legends around. And while we might chuckle at the idea of ancient aliens or shiver at the thought of a pharaoh's curse, these tales are part of the rich tapestry that makes history so endlessly fascinating. And with that, let's leave the myths to marinate for a bit. There's more to explore about these ancient wonders, and plenty more truths to uncover. Stay tuned, because the story of the pyramids is far from finished. All right, let's roll up our sleeves and dive into the pyramids' long-term legacy, both ancient and modern. Because, believe it or not, these towering stone triangles have been influencing more than just the occasional sci-fi plot. First, let's zoom back to ancient times. The pyramids were more than just final resting places for pharaohs with delusions of grandeur. They were the ultimate flex of architectural prowess. These structures didn't just arise from the sands. They rose above them, casting a long shadow over the landscape and the culture. In ancient Egypt, the pyramids served as constant reminders of the divine power wielded by the pharaohs. Think of them as the original skyscrapers, monuments meant to touch the heavens, and by extension, affirm the pharaoh's divine right to rule. They were the grandest of all billboards, broadcasting messages of power and stability that could be seen for miles. Fast forward a few millennia, and the pyramids are still standing tall, but now they're also at the heart of Egypt's tourism industry, a sector that rakes in billions of dollars annually. Let's talk numbers. The Great Pyramid attracts millions of tourists every year, each of whom is willing to brave the desert heat and relentless selfie sticks for a glimpse of these ancient wonders. It's like the ultimate Instagram backdrop, but with a touch more gravitas than your average influencer hangout. The pyramids have become a symbol not just of Egypt, but of human achievement at large, a reminder of what we can accomplish with nothing more than primitive tools and a lot of grit. The influence of the pyramids extends far beyond tourism. They've inspired countless architectural feats across the globe. Take the Louvre Pyramid in Paris, a modern nod to these ancient structures. Designed by I.M. Pei and completed in 1989, it's a striking example of how the pyramidal form continues to captivate architects and the public alike. Or consider the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas, an audacious attempt to bring a slice of ancient Egypt to the Nevada desert, complete with its own light beam shooting skyward. Because why not? These modern interpretations may lack the gravitas of the originals, but they highlight the pyramid's enduring allure. But let's not get carried away with the glitz and glamour. The pyramids also tell a deeper story about ancient Egyptian society and its priorities. They reflect a society that was both deeply religious and highly organized, capable of mobilizing vast resources in pursuit of a singular goal. This wasn't just about building tombs, it was about building a legacy. The Egyptians believed in an afterlife where the soul would need a physical body and earthly possessions. Hence, the pyramids weren't just mausoleums, they were spiritual launch pads designed to propel pharaohs into the afterlife with all the comforts of home. It's like packing a suitcase for eternity and making sure it's first class all the way. Yet, underneath this quest for eternal glory lies a more sobering reality. The pyramids are also a testament to the inequalities of ancient Egyptian society. While the pharaohs enjoyed lavish tombs, the majority of Egyptians lived simple lives, their labor and resources funneled into these colossal projects. It's a reminder that history's great monuments often come with a human cost, one that's too easily glossed over in the shimmering glow of their grandeur. As we wrap up our journey through the sands of time, it's clear that the pyramids are more than just stone structures. They are symbols of human ambition and ingenuity, of societies striving to leave a mark that would endure long after they themselves had turned to dust. They remind us that while the tools and technologies may change, the drive to create something lasting is a constant in human history. The pyramids stand as silent witnesses to our past, beacons of what we can achieve when we come together with shared purpose and vision. So next time you find yourself gazing at these ancient wonders, remember the hands that built them, the dreams they encapsulated, and the legacy they've left behind. In a world that often feels transient, they offer a comforting reminder of permanence. And with that, we bid adieu to the pyramids, a stone-clad testament to human history's grandest ambitions. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and your mind on the marvels of history. Because as the pyramids show us, the past is never as far away as it seems. Your day begins not with a battle cry, but with the clink of coins in your palm and the smell of salt in the air. You're a Viking merchant, and while pop culture loves to paint your people as horned helmeted marauders, your daily grind is more about trade wins than pillaging wins. You stand at the helm of a sleek, dragon-headed longship, not for a raid, but for a journey across the North Sea to the bustling markets of Birka or Hedeby. These ships are your lifeline, sleek marvels of engineering capable of crossing oceans, navigating rivers, and even beaching right up to the shore. It's 800 to 1050 AD, the Viking Age, and you're more interested in the jingle of silver than the clash of swords. Your route is a bustling highway of its time, stretching from the cold fjords of Scandinavia to the exotic bazaars of Baghdad. Yes, Baghdad. You and your fellow merchants are the connective tissue of a vast trade network that rivals any modern supply chain. Forget the looting stereotype for a moment. You're here to make a deal. You're trading furs, walrus ivory, and slaves, a grim reminder of the era's harsh realities, for silk, spices, and silver dirhams. Those silver coins are the dollar bills of your world, and they flow like water along these routes. Your ship, Anar, isn't about speed. It's about capacity. With a beam of up to 5 meters and a length of 16, it can carry tons of cargo, literally. You're not just crossing the sea. You're the Amazon Prime of the 9th century, delivering everything from amber to fine glassware. You sail with a small crew, maybe 10 to 15 hands, each one skilled at both trade and combat because, let's face it, piracy is still a thing. But mostly you're out here to exchange goods peacefully. After all, there's a lot of money to be made. Forget the idea that your economy is all about raiding monasteries. That's just one part of the picture, a sensational story that gets told over and over because who doesn't love a good raid tale? But you're just as likely to be found haggling over a bolt of silk as you are swinging an axe. The silver you're after is crucial. It's the currency that oils the wheels of your trade, and it's what you use to buy land or livestock back home. The Viking world is an interconnected web of commerce, stretching from the icy lands of the north to the sun-drenched shores of the Mediterranean. Economically, your role is vital. The goods you trade aren't just luxury items. They're the necessities and the novelties that knit the Viking world into a global tapestry. Your fur keeps Europeans warm during brutal winters. Your slaves, again, the darker side of this era, maintain the households of the wealthy, and your amber adorns the necks of noblewomen. You're not a lone wolf. You're part of a pack that runs from the British Isles to the steppes of Russia, trading and exchanging goods, ideas, and yes, occasionally a bit of violence when negotiations go south. You've heard the stories of the Viking raids, sure. They're as much a part of your culture as the sagas sung by the Skalds. But for every raid, there are 100 peaceful exchanges, recorded because they lack the drama of a burning monastery. Many Viking leaders, like the legendary Rurik, who founded the Kievan Rus, were more interested in establishing trading posts along rivers than in bloody conquests. Your life as a merchant is about building bridges, sometimes literally, if you're dealing with the Byzantine Empire with its penchant for grand infrastructure. So next time someone mentions Vikings, think of the shipbuilders who crafted your vessel to perfection, the traders who brought back the riches of the East, and the merchants like you who saw the world not as a map of potential conquests, but as a network of bustling markets ready for business. Your world is one of exchange and adventure, of risk and reward, and it's far more complex than any horned helmet could ever convey. So, about those Viking trading voyages, let's peel back the layers of this intricate operation like an onion, one that might just make you cry if you're the one footing the bill. Planning a Viking trade expedition is less about pillaging and more about project management. Think spreadsheets and supply chains, not swords and shields. Before you even set sail, there's the small matter of financing this little adventure. You're going to need backing, and not just the emotional kind. Enter the world of Viking investment circles, the original venture capitalists with an eye for profit. These aren't just wealthy chieftains lounging around in longhouses. No, we're talking about a network of savvy investors who understand that a successful voyage can yield returns to make even the most ambitious hedge fund manager envious. You might find yourself in a smoky hall, pitching your voyage to a gathering of potential backers, each holding a horn of mead and a sharp eye for opportunity. They'll grill you on your route, your cargo, your cruise experience. Think of it as a medieval Shark Tank, minus the television cameras. Once the financing is secured, it's time to assemble your crew. This isn't just a ragtag bunch of burly oarsmen. Your team is a blend of traders, navigators, and yes, a few warriors just in case things get a bit too exciting. You'll want to make sure they've got the right skills. After all, reading the stars and negotiating with Byzantine traders require very different talents. Let's not forget the more mundane, but no less critical tasks like provisioning the ship. You're stocking up on food, water, and trade goods, balancing the weight of cargo with the need for speed and maneuverability. You can't exactly pop into a convenience store in the middle of the North Sea, so careful planning is crucial. With your crew on board and supplies stashed, You're off to one of the great trading hubs of the era, Birka and Hedeby, the wall streets of the Viking world. Located in what is now Sweden and Germany, respectively, these bustling market towns are the beating heart of Viking commerce. Birka, nestled on an island in Lake Mälaren, is a cacophony of languages and cultures, a melting pot of goods from the far reaches of the known world. Meanwhile, Hedeby, strategically positioned on the Jutland Peninsula, serves as a gateway between the North Sea and the Baltic, a vital link in the Viking trade network. Now, let's talk logistics and risk management. Sailing isn't just about catching the wind, it's about navigating the political tides as well. Viking merchants were shrewd diplomats as much as they were traders. The waters you traverse are dotted with kingdoms and territories, each with its own laws and potential for conflict. You'll need to negotiate safe passage with local rulers or risk adding piracy to your list of concerns. Think of it as paying tolls on a medieval highway. But instead of cash, you might be trading goods or favors. And while we're on the topic of risk, let's not ignore the ever-present threat of the sea itself. The North Sea is no placid pond. It's a temperamental beast capable of turning your well-planned venture into a watery grave. Vikings had a healthy respect for the ocean, a mix of reverence and fear that helped them thrive as seafarers. They knew the difference between bravery and foolhardiness, a distinction that could mean the difference between a prosperous return and a tragic loss. Among the notable figures in Viking trade, one cannot overlook the likes of Are, a Norwegian merchant who journeyed all the way to the court of King Alfred in England. Are's travels were a testament to the reach and ambition of Viking traders. His accounts provide a glimpse into the life of a trader navigating both the physical and social landscapes of the Viking world. Are wasn't just moving goods, he was forging connections and building relationships, a crucial aspect of successful trading. Speaking of social structures, let's debunk a myth or two about gender roles in Viking society. While pop culture often depicts Vikings as a male-dominated society, the reality was more nuanced. Women in Viking society could own property, run businesses, and yes, participate in trade. The sagas and historical records mention women like Aud the Deep-Minded, who not only managed her own estate, but also organized a colonizing expedition to Iceland. Viking women were more than just passive observers. They were active participants in the economic and social spheres of their time. In the world of Viking trade, socio-economic hierarchies played a crucial role. The chieftains and wealthy merchants at the top wielded significant power, but they relied on a network of freemen and thralls to keep their enterprises running. This hierarchical system was both a strength and a vulnerability, as it required careful management of resources and relationships. So, as you sail the high seas, trading your furs and amber for silk and silver, remember that you're part of a grand tapestry of commerce that stretches across continents. You're not just a merchant, you're an essential cog in a complex machine that keeps the Viking world turning. In this world, the real treasure isn't just the silver you bring home, it's the connections you forge and the stories you tell. Because at the end of the day, the true legacy of the Vikings isn't just their raids or their conquests. It's their ability to connect distant lands and diverse peoples through the power of trade. Navigating the high seas with your cargo of furs and amber, you're not just connecting lands. You're weaving a tapestry of cultures that's as intricate as a Viking rune stone. Now, let's dive into those trade routes, the ones that stretch from the chilly fjords of Scandinavia all the way to the sun-drenched spires of the Byzantine Empire. These routes, dear friend, are the lifelines of your Viking merchant life, and they're anything but a straight line from A to B. Let's start with the journey to Byzantium, or as you might know it, Constantinople, the glittering jewel of the East. The path there is like a choose-your-own-adventure book, complete with pirates, political intrigue, and the occasional shipwreck. As you set sail from your northern home, you first navigate the Baltic Sea, a veritable highway teeming with trade ships, and yes, the odd pirate looking to expand his inventory. The Baltic, with its bracing winds and icy waters, is your first challenge. Your Nar must deftly maneuver past the myriad islands dotting this sea, like a maritime game of hopscotch. Once you hit the Gulf of Finland, it's time to hoist those sails and make your way to the mighty rivers like the Dnieper and the Volga. These rivers are your express lanes to riches, cutting through the vast Slavic lands and connecting you to the markets of the East. But hold on, this isn't just a leisurely cruise. Each river you navigate is a series of toll booths. Local Slavic tribes, keen on profiting from your passage, demand tributes, a bit of your cargo, a few coins, or maybe a favor down the line. It's a medieval toll system, and you're left balancing the books to ensure your journey remains profitable. Think of it as an old-school version of PayPal, only with more spears and fewer guarantees. As you journey onward, cultural exchanges become the spice of life, quite literally. You're not just trading goods, you're swapping stories, ideas, and even guards. Take language, for instance. Your travels expose you to a babel of tongues: Old Norse, Slavic dialects, Greek, Arabic. You might find yourself haggling in a smattering of languages, a linguistic stew that would make even the most seasoned polyglot dizzy. It's like Duolingo, Viking edition. Religion, too, finds its way into the mix. The Norse pantheon of Odin, Thor, and Freyja often rubs shoulders with the Christian saints and Byzantine icons. This cultural osmosis means that by the time you reach the sophisticated courts of Constantinople, you're as likely to see a Viking wearing a Thor's hammer as you are a Byzantine cross. It's a spiritual buffet, and you're sampling it all. Now, let's talk about the commodities that make this long trek worthwhile. Amber, often referred to as the gold of the north, is one of your hardest tickets. This fossilized tree resin, glowing like captured sunlight, is in high demand in the Mediterranean. It's not just a pretty trinket, it's believed to have mystical properties, making it a must-have for any self-respecting Byzantine noble. Then there's furs, nature's winter coat. As a Viking trader, you're practically a mobile department store of pelts. Sable, ermine, fox, you name it. These furs are not just luxury items, they're necessities for surviving the brutal winters of Europe. Your customers range from Slavic chieftains to Byzantine emperors, all eager to wrap themselves in the warmth of the north. And now, the darker side of the trade, slaves. As grim as it is, the trade in human lives is a significant part of your cargo. Slaves captured during raids or sold into servitude are bartered alongside your other goods. It's a bleak reminder of the era's harsh realities, a time when human rights were a concept as foreign as the lands you traverse. But back to commerce. The silver dirham, your currency of choice, is more than just a medium of exchange. It's a symbol of connectivity. These coins, minted in the Islamic caliphates, have a global journey of their own, traveling from the bazaars of Baghdad to the markets of Burqa and beyond. They're the universal currency of your world, each one a testament to the vast network of trade you operate within. Reaching the Byzantine Empire, you find yourself in a world of opulence and grandeur, where the streets are lined with gold and the air is thick with incense. Here, you're not just a trader, you're an ambassador of the North, bringing a taste of the Viking world to the heart of Eastern civilization. Your goods, once humble items from the forests and shores of Scandinavia, are transformed into treasures in the eyes of your Byzantine buyers. The cultural exchanges facilitated by these trade routes are profound. You're not just exchanging goods, you're swapping ideas, technologies, and ways of life. Byzantine glassware, intricate and delicate, finds its way into the hands of Norse artisans, inspiring new designs and techniques. Likewise, the sturdy Viking longship, with its shallow draft and swift lines, influences naval designs far beyond the shores of Scandinavia. Yet, amid the bustle of trade and the swirl of cultures, remember that you're part of something larger. Your journeys help knit together a world that's more interconnected than it appears on any ancient map. You're a pioneer in a global economy, a player in a complex dance of commerce and culture that transcends borders and binds distant lands. So next time someone mentions Vikings, think beyond the swords and raids. Picture the traders who dared to navigate the vast waters, who bridged worlds with their courage and curiosity. In the grand tapestry of history, your role is vital, a thread that connects the icy north with the sunlit south, weaving a story of adventure, exchange, and human endeavor that echoes through the ages. But let's snap back to reality for a second, because being a Viking merchant wasn't all about basking in the glow of Byzantine opulence. Nope, it was a career fraught with challenges that would make even the most intrepid entrepreneur break a sweat. The romantic notion of Vikings as fearless adventurers sailing into the unknown. Well, it's time to pull back the curtain and take a good, hard look at the nitty-gritty of Viking trade. First up, let's talk about piracy. You might think that Vikings were the original buccaneers of the high seas, and you wouldn't be entirely wrong. But as a merchant, you're not the one swinging from ropes with a cutlass between your teeth. Instead, you're the one watching the horizon with a wary eye, hoping those sails in the distance belong to friendly traders and not a band of marauders eager to relieve you of your cargo, and possibly your life. Piracy was rampant, and not just by sea. That inland trek you're making along the Dnieper or Volga, it's a veritable buffet for river pirates. And if piracy didn't get you, warfare might. The Viking Age was a period of almost constant conflict, with petty kings and chieftains vying for control of territories like kids squabbling over the best toy. Your trading routes were often tangled in these political skirmishes, making safe passage more of a negotiation than a certainty. You better have a diplomat's tongue and a warrior's heart. Sometimes those tolls weren't paid in silver or goods, but in blood. Weather was another unpredictable adversary. The North Sea wasn't known for its gentle breezes and sunny skies. Storms could whip up faster than gossip at a thing that's a Viking assembly, not something from Stranger Things. You had to be a meteorologist in your own right, reading the skies and seas, and knowing when to push forward and when to seek shelter. Imagine trying to navigate through pea-soup fog with nothing but a sunstone and a prayer. Quite the adventure, until it wasn't. Political instability also played a hand in shaping trade decisions. The shifting alliances and rivalries between kingdoms meant that yesterday's trading partner could be today's adversary. A friendly port could turn hostile overnight, leaving you high and dry, or worse, imprisoned and stripped of your goods. Vikings had to be adept at reading political landscapes, knowing when to ingratiate themselves with local rulers and when to hightail it out of a volatile situation. Speaking of volatile, let's not forget the economic ups and downs. Viking merchants were the ultimate gamblers. The markets of Berka and Hedeby could fluctuate like a Norse saga on fast forward. Prices for goods like walrus ivory or silk could skyrocket or crash depending on supply and demand, political shifts, or even the latest trends in Byzantine fashion. You had to have a keen business acumen, knowing when to sell high and buy low, or risk returning home with nothing but tales of woe. Primary sources give us glimpses of these challenges. Take the account of Ara, the Norwegian merchant we mentioned earlier. His journey to King Alfred's court wasn't just a stroll across the North Sea. It was a calculated risk that required navigating not just waters, but the complex political and social currents of the time. Ara's tales, recorded in the Old English Orosius, reveal a merchant's life less about carefree adventure and more about shrewd navigation of both seas and societies. The romanticized image of Viking merchants as fearless adventurers glosses over the reality that many were just as cautious and calculating as any modern-day CEO. Sure, they had the spirit of adventure, but it was tempered by a keen sense of survival and a sharp eye for opportunity. After all, the stakes were high. A failed voyage didn't just mean a bad quarter, it could mean financial ruin or death. But don't toss out the notion of adventure entirely. There's a reason the Viking Age is steeped in legend. The sheer scale of their voyages, the daring of their trade routes, and the cultural exchanges they facilitated were remarkable feats for the time. Yet, it's important to remember that behind every heroic saga was a merchant calculating risks, balancing books, and making deals as much with their heads as with their hearts. So while you're out there on choppy waters, remember that you're not just a fearless adventurer. You're a strategist, a diplomat, and a survivor. The romantic allure of the Viking Age might paint you as a swashbuckling hero, but the reality is you're navigating a complex, often dangerous world filled with both peril and possibility. And that, my friend, makes your story all the more compelling. So, as the waves crash against your Nar, and you balance between the allure of legend and the gritty reality of Viking commerce, let's steer our longship towards the legacy of these rugged entrepreneurs. What did it all lead to? This grand tapestry of trade woven across continents? Well, spoiler alert, it's a tale of influence, decline, and a legacy that's as stubbornly enduring as a Norse saga. Picture the medieval European economy as a puzzle, and there you are, a Viking merchant, slarding in a crucial piece. These trade routes you navigated weren't just about swapping furs for silk. They were the highways of cultural and economic exchange that helped knit medieval Europe into a coherent whole. The influx of silver dirhams, the prized currency of your time, boosted local economies, allowing them to flourish and trade even further. It's like you were the original Kickstarter, funding the economic boom of the Middle Ages. But here's where history, that ever-fickle beast, throws a twist. By the 11th century, Viking trade began to decline, not because you lost your knack for negotiation, but because the world around you changed. Political landscapes shifted like the sands of a Scandinavian beach. Kingdoms consolidated power, and new players entered the scene. The consolidation of England under kings like Ethelred and the subsequent rise of the Normans meant that those once lucrative raids and trade networks faced stiff competition and even stiffer opposition. Enter the Hanseatic League, the 12th century trading powerhouse that made even the savviest Viking merchant look like a small-time hustler. This coalition of German towns dominated trade in the Baltic and beyond, effectively muscling in on your turf. With organized trade routes, standardized practices, and enough bureaucratic red tape to strangle a longship, they represented the new wave of medieval commerce. It was like the Vikings had been running mom-and-pop stores, and the Hanseatic League showed up with a medieval version of Walmart. As if that wasn't enough, political changes back home also played their part. The Christianization of Scandinavia shifted societal values and power structures, leading to a more centralized authority that wasn't quite as keen on marauding merchants. The Viking Age, with its mix of raiding and trading, gave way to a more settled, feudal society. Those long voyages to Byzantium and beyond became less frequent as the focus turned inward towards agriculture and local governance. Yet, despite this decline, the threads of Viking trade wove themselves deep into the fabric of European economies and cultures. Take urban development, for instance. The bustling markets of Hedeby and Birka laid the groundwork for the rise of medieval cities. These hubs of commerce became templates for future towns, with their vibrant trade attracting artisans, craftsmen, and traders from across the known world. The economic principles of supply and demand, honed by Viking traders, became integral to the medieval economy. And let's not forget the cultural impact. Those linguistic exchanges, the culinary influences, and even the religious syncretism that Viking merchants facilitated didn't just disappear. They evolved. The Norse gods might have made way for the Christian saints, but the spirit of exploration and exchange lived on. The sagas, those epic tales of heroism and adventure, continued to capture imaginations, evolving into the myths and legends that still enchant us today. Vikings became the rock stars of medieval Europe, remembered as much for their bravado as for their business acumen. Now, here's the kicker. Viking trade practices still ripple through the modern world. The very idea of a global supply chain, a network of interconnected markets trading goods and ideas, echoes the trade routes you once navigated. Those silver dirhams. Think of them as the prototype for our modern currency exchanges, a testament to the enduring power of trade to connect diverse economies. And then there's the myth. The romanticized image of the Viking, horned helmet gleaming, standing at the prow of a ship, the wind in his hair. Sure, it's more Hollywood than history, but it speaks to a deeper truth. The Vikings encapsulated the spirit of adventure and the thrill of the unknown. They were the original disruptors, challenging the status quo and daring to explore new markets and new worlds. So, as you lay down to rest after a long day of trading, or after a long night of listening to tales of Viking glory, remember that the legacy of Viking merchants is as much about the enduring impact of their economic practices as it is about the legends they left behind. They were more than marauders. They were the architects of a connected world, their influence echoing through the ages with every trade agreement, every cultural exchange, and every story told of their daring exploits. The Viking Age may have ended, but its spirit sails on, as relentless and adventurous as ever.